Okay, so the first one is a savory breakfast,
Yes.
right? And I think that goes into this idea of getting started because it also relates to starting the day.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that so many people on this podcast have talked about is kind of like how you start the day, how you start the morning sets the tone for the rest of the day. I've noticed myself right now, we're dealing with sort of daylight savings here in the US. And we're in a place where a lot of people, by not having that hour of sleep that they've lost, I'm seeing with my wife, she's craving more, right? I'm noticing with myself, I went to a workout this morning, I felt a little bit off. So even how we sleep, how, getting that morning light, what we eat in the morning, those things are very important. They set the tone for the day. What have you found, before we get into the hack, when somebody starts off with a traditional starchy breakfast and sweet breakfast, typically what does that look like? And what are the results that stack later on in the day?
So the typical sort of glucose spiking breakfast is the breakfast that most people eat, which is, cereal, bread, jam, fruit juices, oats, anything that's just starches and sugars. And for most people who have been eating that way their whole life, and that was me in the past, they don't realize that that breakfast is going to control them for the rest of the day. With the glucose spike at breakfast, they're putting a coin into the glucose roller coaster, which is going to make them spike, drop, spike, drop, spike, drop all day. It's going to make them hungry every 2 hours, craving foods, feeling tired, feeling fatigued. And that's where it comes back to, some people just think that's who they are. They just think that they're just somebody who's tired, who's cranky, who has a lot of cravings, who gets hangry. And actually, when you switch that, when you give to your body a breakfast that does not cause a glucose spike, it's like being in a movie and stepping through the mirror. You have a completely different experience of your day. And today, if you were to tell me, Jessie, okay, today just have some fun, eat a sweet breakfast, I would not do it because I know now how badly it impacts how I feel and my whole day. So by switching to a savory breakfast, which is a breakfast built around protein, essentially, and that does not contain anything sweet except some whole fruit for taste if you want, you keep your glucose levels steady. You actually unlock energy from within your cells. You help your mitochondria function better. You feel like awake for the whole day. And by, 12 or whenever lunch comes around, like you're happy to eat, but you're not famished. You're not feeling controlled by this impulse to just grab anything that's around you and near you. So it's really the pillar of a steady glucose life. And often when people change their breakfast from sweet and starchy to savory, their whole experience of life changes. It's quite remarkable.
Before I even really knew fully about the world of glucose and everything, even though my business partner has written one of like the early sort of bestsellers in blood sugar, I just naturally saw myself where I would have this kind of sugary smoothie bomb during my plant-based days. And as I got into the world of functional medicine and got more into healthy protein and all those things like that, I would see just how much more mental clarity. I think that's one of the first things that people notice, that energy and that mental clarity, that you can show up, you can pay attention, and it doesn't feel like this artificial spike up.
Exactly. And so 2 things on that. One, when you have sugar and starches at breakfast, you may think you're getting energy. What's actually happening is that dopamine is getting released in your brain. So you feel like, whoa, you feel awake. That's not energy. That's dopamine. And afterwards, you just crash. And second, let's talk about that brain clarity, the brain fog. I just read some really interesting papers that show us that one of the main symptoms in the brain of being on a glucose roller coaster is brain fog. Can you guess how the glucose roller coaster is leading to brain fog, Drew?
Tell us.
Okay. So every single cell in your body feels the effect of glucose spikes, which are inflammation, glycation, insulin release. And the cells in your brain also feel this impact. The cells in your brain are called neurons. Your neurons, when they're under stress from being on a glucose roller coaster, the speed of the signal between them slows down. Literally, the information in your brain slows down, and that can be felt as brain fog. which I find so fascinating because the reason I even got into this whole thing in the first place was because my mental health was out of whack. I felt anxious, depressed, and I had this really intense brain fog. I would just feel like everything around me went from like 3D to 2D. I felt like there was a sort of weird like mesh between me and the world. It felt very blurry, very strange. And now, I understand, the more I was having spikes in my diet, the more often that was happening. There was a real correlation. So yes, to come back to what you were saying, when you switch from sweet and starchy breakfast to savory breakfast, brain clarity really improves. And as a result, when you're clearer and you have more energy and you feel better, you can be in your purpose more easily. You can connect with yourself and be like, this is what I want to do today. This is important to me. And you can go after the stuff you really want to go after instead of being a victim to all of these symptoms that you don't know what to do about.
Yeah, it's like when you get that dopamine hit from a lot of refined starch or sugar, your brain is also kind of on that next dopamine hit of what's going to replace it.
Very addictive.
And part of what's addicted is also seeing what everybody else is up to, and the addiction. I've shared this before, but one of the toughest addictions to get over is the addiction of needing everybody else to tell you what you should pay attention to, what you should focus on, which also includes media.
Explain what you mean.
So there's a lot of people that have an addiction to not listening to their gut and needing the voice of others, media, social media, whatever. They want to know what's important that day. What should I pay attention to? Everybody else tell me what I should pay attention to. What should I prioritize? Sometimes on Twitter, they call it the current thing. What should I be upset about today? Right? Tell me what I should be upset about. Tell me what I should be enraged about. Tell me who's the enemy today?
Wow.
Who's the reason that I'm not able to pursue my dreams and goals in life? And that is an addiction. And I see when you start off the day with one addiction of sugar, and it's a quick dopamine spike, it's kind of like, all right, what's going to give me that next dopamine spike? Well, negativity actually can create a dopamine hit inside of the body. It's like, all right, cool. I know who I should be upset about. Here's who to blame. Here's what the government's doing wrong. Here's what this industry is doing wrong. Let's put the attention on them instead of, what do you want to do in your life? What do you want to give love and attention to? What do you want to write? What is that idea you've been sitting on? What is that business you want to create? What is that nonprofit you've been meaning to want to help out with? How do you want to reconnect with your partner or your kids or other stuff that intrinsically matters to you and is not the priority of somebody else?
Wow. Yes.
I think one roller coaster causes us to look for the next thing, and it's all about taking us out of our body. And it goes back to you sharing, when you're more balanced, it's easier to tap into your purpose. And I truly feel that it has all sorts of implications in our life.
And for me in my work now, I know one of the reasons that I've been successful is because my glucose levels are steady and I'm not being controlled by this roller coaster and this, chemical stuff happening in my brain where I can really decide what to focus on. And I feel like it gives you your agency back in a way. Instead of just, as you said, like just being a victim to whatever everybody else or the food industry or the food landscape or how you're eating, what everybody else is making you feel and think, you can actually reconnect and be more grounded. Just be like, okay, this is what I actually want to do. And now my brain is clear. I have energy. I feel good. I can do that. Because often, I think many of us, we want to do the things that we care about. It's that motivation thing again. It's like, yeah, I want to start that business. Yeah, I want to spend time with my friends and my family. Yeah, I want to do X and Y and Z, but you just don't feel good. So it's really hard to do it.
It's true. When you don't feel good, you cannot give love and attention to the things that you want to.
No. And you're just looking for dopamine in different things.
What does I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in the context of the first hack, what does your movement typical routine look like in a week? Even though that's one of the hacks, I'm bringing it up because are there ever times where you find having some carbohydrates in the morning, right, is something that helps you perform better? For example, if you're going to go do immediately something like an intense strength training workout. Is that something that you've ever noticed?
For sure. And, in the savory breakfast hack, carbs are not off limits. Nowhere in this do you have to cut out carbs, but in a savory breakfast, you need to build your breakfast around protein and fat. And then you can add starches and whole fruit if you want for taste, no problem. They just can't be the center of your breakfast. And in the context of exercising, yeah, of course, you need to give your body available glucose. So if you do savory breakfast and then, an hour later, you're going to do an intense HIIT training class, like add some starches, add some fruit as much as you feel like you need so that you can get that rapid energy to fuel that workout. But if you're just, going for a walk, you don't really need to fuel up.
Totally.
But if you're doing something intense, absolutely, it's super important. And so in the method, it gives you so much flexibility. You can try one of the beautiful recipes in the book, but then you can also just create your own. And I tend to intuitively just feel how many starches and sugar, like in whole fruit I need in the morning. So for example, this morning, I really wanted some rice because I have a big day and I have lots of stuff to do. And it just felt good to add more of those starches than I usually would. But again, my breakfast was salmon and olive oil and cheese. Like it was built around protein and fat, which is always non-negotiable. Because if I had just rice, I would actually not get the same effect. I would be here and I would be crashing. So it's protein, fat first, and then as many starches and whole fruit as you want so that you get to your goals.
I was on the rice train this morning too.
Yeah, it's a rice day.
3 times a week when I go in for my strength training workout, I'm working out with this group up the street called Ultimate Performance. Shout out to them. They're really great. And they're intense strength training. And then you end the sort of workout on this like HIIT. And in the beginning, because I was all about like, okay, I don't want to have a lot of carbs. I'm not going to have carbs in the morning. This is how I feel best. And then I started to realize like when I don't have, maybe on the days that I'm working out more heavy, some things, and just like you said, carbs are not off the table. There's no food that's off the table. Mm-hmm. It's built around these hacks. Mm-hmm. But when I was under eating on carbs, I would see my performance go down.
For sure.
Right? I couldn't lift as much. I couldn't pull as much on the deadlift. And my trainer, Sean, was like, you know what? I know you want to eat this way, but like you just got to bring in a little bit more carbs that are here.
Because your muscles, they need glucose for energy.
Of course.
And if there's circulating glucose available, they're going to be really happy to use it for, explosive power, especially if you're doing explosive kind of work.
Yes.
If you're running like a 4-hour marathon, it's going to be a different situation than if you're doing, I don't know, is it an hour? How long is your class?
It's an hour, yeah.
Yeah, an hour of like explosive training, weightlifting, where you have to bam, bam, bam. Like, yeah, of course. Then you definitely need glucose for energy. Otherwise, you're going to feel a bit like sluggish.
Yeah. And like you said, I still have the fat, I still have like
the protein,
like my whey protein, grass-fed whey protein. Sometimes I'll have a little bit of Greek yogurt.
Love.
I don't like to eat too much fat before I work out. It's all personal preferences and stuff, but a little bit of protein and a little bit of rice. I literally had whey protein and rice this morning before I went in.
Like mixed together?
No, just separate. Not mixed together.
Okay,
not mixed together.
Okay.
I'm not blending rice into my whey protein. I
had
some whey protein
a cookbook here, Drew.
to get my 30 grams, 40 grams of protein to start off the day. Had a little bit of rice for that fuel. Went in, had a great workout.
Amazing.
And still, because I'm working out on the days that I'm eating a little bit more carbohydrates, generally, I don't have a CGM on today, but I've measured it before. I'm still within the lifestyle following, all these principles here. I'm good, and my fasting insulin is good too.
Absolutely. And on the topic of muscles, our muscles are amazing allies in steadying our glucose levels. And in week 4 of the glucose goddess method, that's what we start introducing 10 minutes of movement after one meal once a day. Because when your muscles are contracting, again, as you just said, they're going to be using glucose for energy. And so we can use that to our advantage. And that's why the hack asks you to do 10 minutes of very light movement. It can be like, walking your dog, cleaning your kitchen, or my new favorite, the soleil push-up, the calf raises. You know that one?
No, say it again.
So we'll do it together. So put your feet on the ground.
Okay.
And then just do calf raises. So you get onto your tippy toes and back down.
Yeah.
And your calf actually contains this muscle called the soleus muscle, which is extra good at soaking up glucose from the bloodstream. So that also counts as 10 minutes of movement if you just don't want to get up and you're at work, for example.
I'm a natural fidgeter, so I feel like I'm doing that all
Perfect.
day. By the way, shout out to Tessa who's doing it over there on the side.
Yes.
That also might fall into, have you seen this terminology? I forgot what it stands for. Maybe we could look it up. But NEAT, right? Like these are the people who are sort of fidgeting all day.
Yes.
That
what is it
seem
called?
to be
non-exercise activity thermo something?
Yeah. Tessa, can we look that up? NEAT.
Exercise.
And we'll look up the meaning.
I got it right. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis.
Thermogenesis is the energy expended for everything we do that's not sleeping, eating, or sport-like exercises. It ranges from the expanded walking to work, typing, performing. So there's some people that are naturally a little bit fidgety during the day. I'm definitely one of them. Like my right leg or left leg is always kind of moving up and down in the form that you talked about.
Yeah.
And it could explain why some people are just burning some extra calories throughout the day.
Extra glucose, yeah. So this, it feels like it's just any kind of time where your muscles are using glucose that is not specifically like intentional exercise, right? So for example, I don't know, maybe right now, as we're talking, my hands are moving and then maybe that would count as well. Or I walked up the stairs, maybe that counts, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
But it's just your muscles using glucose during the day.
Totally. And it seems that there are some people that have a little bit more of a need.
Oh, look. Include anything from walking the dog, cooking, carrying the shopping home, doing the gardening, playing with your children, washing the car, or even fidgeting at your desk.
Fidgeting at your desk.
That's you.
That's me.
Well, that's so interesting. So actually, the week 4 hack is exactly that. It explains that you can use any of these activities to take advantage of the glucose burning stuff that your muscle does.
Yeah.
You can also do intense workout if you want, or go ice skating or whatever, but this counts because this is also going to use up glucose for energy. So also reduce the spike of a meal.
Totally. And it replicates, what we probably see in a lot of these blue zones that are out there is that people are not going to the gym. And, of course, the blue zones are quickly, like evaporating because those lifestyles are not the same anymore. People are moving out of there. Processed food is coming in, all the trappings of Western society. But from what I've seen, those communities are moving around a lot just naturally throughout the day. Like working out is sort of integrated into their day as sheep farmers and other stuff.
And isn't there also something that in blue zones, people are in community a lot?
Community, for sure.
And to be honest, like the more looking into this, the more it seems so clear that that's a really big determinant of health, Having relationships that feel nourishing, where you don't feel alone, you feel supported, you feel loved. Yeah, I mean, that's key. Again, glucose is not everything, it's just one
but it's
thing.
Really, it's the methodology that you have established on top of glucose is the larger lifestyle around it.
Exactly.
Right?
So the glucose hacks in this method, to me, they're the foundation. They're just the foundation of health. If you don't have this under control, no matter what you do on top, it's just never going to be fully thriving. You need to fix your glucose levels to have any sort of healthy physical or mental health situation. You just need to, because with unsteady glucose levels, so many systems in your body are under stress and you're never going to be fully thriving. So after the 4 weeks, once you have that under control, then you can start layering stuff. And then you can just start having a lot of fun and feeling really, really good.
Part of what you're highlighting, I believe, when I was looking through the PDF in this new book, is also you're giving recipes that are available to people.
Oh, Drew,
right?
In my very strong intention of making this as simple as possible, people have been asking me for recipes for like a whole year now since my first book came out. So in each week, you have about 30 to 40 really easy recipes to actually do the hack. So week 1, savory breakfast, there are 30 recipes in there that will inspire you to actually get started. Some are vegan, some are gluten-free, whatever. But what's really key here is that each recipe is 6 ingredients or less. So it really doesn't take very long to do. I made sure of 2 things. One, on each recipe page, in the ingredients list, you actually have little cutouts of the actual food. I want people to open a page and be like, wow, this is so easy. I have these things in my cupboard. It's not a complicated recipe book. It's really just a guide. It's really me moving in with you and saying like, hey, Drew, you have these 3 things in your kitchen. Let's make, the savory omelet for breakfast. And then in the actual recipe pages itself, each bullet, for example, has the bolded ingredient in it. So you know very clearly, okay, step 1, I need the eggs and the feta. Step 2, the tomatoes and the butter. I just tried to make this as easy to start as possible. Seriously, like all my focus and energy has been on how do I make this incredibly easy to do. And the photos are stunning. Tessa, maybe you can
do we have an
pull
example
up
of
the
a
photos.
recipe that we could pull up? Or is it in the PDF?
So these are the actual photography.
Oh, beautiful.
It's gorgeous, huh? But then in the pages themselves, you have the ingredients, which are not showed here. But I wanted to figure out, like, what does glucose goddess feel like in terms of recipe photography? And I think I just absolutely love what we did. It feels so fresh and so easy and so friendly and so glucose goddess and so fun. So for example, this is a recipe of breakfast for, I always say that, ice cream for breakfast. It's so funny. I always say breakfast for ice cream. This is the ice cream for breakfast recipe.
Ice cream for breakfast.
So it's actually really simple. It's Greek yogurt and berries and nut butter.
I literally just made this not this one, but something like this in my newsletter last week.
Amazing.
Not with the nut butter. I got to try that.
So again, like super friendly, super easy. And it's really just me bringing lots of love to you in your kitchen and your home and just helping you get started.
Yeah, that's amazing. So ice cream for breakfast.
Yeah, not
right?
breakfast for ice cream.
Not breakfast for ice cream. What is one of your classics that's in here that's a go-to?
It's my 2-egg omelet with feta and tomatoes. I've probably made this breakfast hundreds of times. Super easy. So when I was younger, I used to have a Nutella crepe every morning for breakfast and orange juice. Shout out to my mom. This was not a good breakfast. I felt horrible and hungry 2 hours later, but I had this for like many, many, many years. And so the concept of a crepe for breakfast has stayed very dear to my heart. And so a couple of years ago, I was like, how can I make this concept like actually work for my glucose levels? So very simply, I took 2 eggs, whipped them up, and I poured them into a pan so they become quite flat, almost like thin like a crepe. I don't move the eggs around and they just cook like that very slowly as I put cherry tomatoes and feta. And then I just fold the egg crepe over. Yeah. And that's my 2-egg omelet, which I adore. And it's so delicious with some hot sauce.
Did you recently post about that on Instagram? Like a Nutella versus that?
Oh,
I think I saw
absolutely.
Something.
Nutella crepe, it comes up a lot in my graphs because, that's something that I like eating and that's been in my life for a while.
There we go. There we have the Nutella crepe versus, again, if you're seeing this on YouTube, you can see the screen that we're sharing over here.
So this is cool because what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to show people how the recipes in my book actually impact your glucose levels.
So could you describe this, what we're seeing for the people that are listening on audio?
So the top graph you see here is the Nutella crepe. So it's just a glucose spike, pretty simple. On the bottom graph, what I'm doing is I'm bringing in a drink from week 2 of the glucose goddess method, which is called the GG Classic, which is a very simple way of using the vinegar hack. So 1 tablespoon of vinegar in a tall glass of water before eating something.
Which is hack number 2.
Hack number 2 reduces the spike of that food. And so here I tested the GG Classic with then my favorite Nutella crepe. And as you can see, the spike is tiny. Now, importantly, I'm not like using these tests to draw conclusions. This is just illustrating studies showing that vinegar before eating has an impact on glucose levels. Mm-hmm. I'm not like drawing conclusions from my N of 1 experiment. I'm just illustrating. And then Tessa, if you scroll on the post, you'll see the second panel to it. So here's the actual photo of the recipe. This is the GG Classic. So I'm wearing a nice GG suit. So that's one of the recipes in week 2. And so this is a nice transition. So in week 2 of the method, we introduce vinegar once a day to our diet before the meal that's highest in starches and sugars, because the vinegar contains a molecule called acetic acid, which helps reduce the spike of a meal. Acetic acid acts on alpha amylase, which is the enzyme that breaks down starches into glucose in your body, and it slows down that enzyme. As a result, the glucose molecules arrive more slowly into your intestine and then more slowly into your bloodstream. And second, acetic acid goes to your muscles and tells your muscles to soak up extra glucose as it arrives in your bloodstream, a little bit like exercise does. So with the addition of vinegar once a day, you can still eat whatever you're eating, but with less of a spike. Therefore, less of that creation of the glucose roller coaster. So that's week 2. And by the way, this is like the simplest, most boring recipe in Vinegar Week. I worked really hard to create 30 recipes of ways to drink your vinegar that are delicious. From mocktails to teas to dressings, like now adding the vinegar into your life is going to be super, super fun.
And just to clarify, so people who are not seeing the video, there's a straw in there, because last time when we were talking about vinegar, all the dentists that follow me were like, you got to make sure to tell people to drink it with a straw. It's going to destroy their teeth.
So I spoke to a bunch of dentists and they said, as long as it's diluted in water, it's actually not that damaging. But if you want to be extra safe, add a straw. What you want to really avoid is doing like a shot of the vinegar. That's not really good for your enamel. However, once it's diluted, it seems fine.
So from the background that I'm from, the Indian tradition, growing up, we would typically have some fermented veggies, other things. Do you know if there's a similar effect? It's not straight vinegar, But is there any, and I know a lot of traditions and cultures that are out there
Absolutely.
have fermented foods, which have its own benefit, gut microbiome, etc. But do you know if there's any benefit in the same way that drinking vinegar? I have to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, AG1, a product that I've literally been taking for years. AG1 is a daily foundational nutritional supplement that supports whole body health. I take it every single morning. It features 75 vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and whole food sourced ingredients. So I know I'm getting an extra dose of beneficial nutrients in addition to the food that I'm eating. This supplement supports healthy aging because it includes all the incredible benefits that many of the experts that you've seen on my show talk about. And the best part about it is it's so easy to take. Just take a scoop of AG1, throw it in cold water or add it to your shaker bottle, and that's literally it. Drink it up. Right now, my community can try AG1 if you head to the link in the description below. And the best part, you'll get a free 1-year supply of AG1's D3 vitamin K2 plus 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase of AG1. Just head over to drinkag1.com/Drew. I know you're going to love AG1 as much as I do.
I think it has a similar effect to week 3, which is the veggie starter.
Okay.
I think that's really what we see around the world. Even in France, we have this old tradition of crudité, which is just raw veggies before a meal. Italy, antipasti, veggies before the meal. There's a lot of these traditions of having some plants at the beginning of the meal. And I think the biggest benefit we're getting from a sort of immediate glucose impact is that the fiber in those fermented veggies is slowing down the glucose absorption. But then in terms of the vinegar thing, well, there are quite a few traditions in the world that actually, drink vinegar as a health drink. In Iran, lots of people make their own apple cider vinegar and have it on a daily basis because it's considered healthy. What's cool...
And do you know, do they drink it just recreationally? Are they having it before a meal? Is it like...
They drink it just multiple times a day. It's like a tradition. And what's really interesting about all this is that all the hacks that I share and that we now know from the science are really good for our glucose levels. They've been around. They've been around. We've known culturally for generations that vinegar is good, that veggies before a meal is good, that walking after a meal is good. I heard there's an Indian tradition or custom called 100 steps after a meal. Is that true? Have you heard that before?
I've never heard it called that, but I would just say religiously growing up, my grandparents were always the one we would eat and they'd say, all right, we're going to walk around the neighborhood.
There you go. Again, that's the week 4 hack. We've known these things, Drew, but we've become so disconnected.
Right.
That really now what we're seeing is that we just need to add back in these very wise traditions and they're going to help our health a lot. Same with breakfast. We never used to eat sweet foods for breakfast. That was an invention of the 20th century. We used to have just regular food for breakfast. There was no breakfast is a special moment where you only eat dessert. What? Doesn't make any sense.
Totally random. But do you know the history of Kellogg's and how it was put together?
No.
So I'm going to butcher this a little bit. But essentially the founder of Kellogg's and these breakfast cereals was a gentleman who was quite religious, maybe religiosity, right? Really having strong views on certain topics, including specifically libido and how do we cut the drive to masturbate.
Why?
Because he just believed that was sinful, right? The lust and sort of having that aspect. And so had a clinic, and I know some listeners reached out previously and pushed back and said this isn't true, but I found a bunch of articles where it detailed this out fully. We can link to them as well, where they realized through serving these refined brands, these refined grains, that he was able to successfully sort of cut people's libido off. That's literally the history of Kellogg's and breakfast cereal.
I wonder if he actually figured out that with a lot of starches and sugars for breakfast, you're just harming your hormones. So your hormones just become out of whack and you don't have that sexual drive anymore. That's fascinating.
It's nuts. There's a couple documentaries and stuff. We'll link to them on Netflix.
Tessa, I remembered, if you go back to the middle website and then click on pre-order now.
Amazing.
So that's an example.
For people who are listening, we brought up a recipe. You can find the link in the show notes, again, to pre-order the book on Amazon. And we brought up an image on side of the Amazon page. And the recipe, which I'll hand it over to you to talk about, is the perfect 7 7-minute eggs.
Mm-hmm.
So these look like some version of deviled eggs?
No, they're just simply soft-boiled eggs. And this
Okay.
is the first recipe in the breakfast week.
Okay, got it.
And again, super, super simple. I love the photography here with my hands. It's so cool. And you see on the left where it explains what you need. Again, I'm showing little photos of the eggs. And then Tessa, if we go to the next recipe, we might see some more stuff. Yeah, so this is an example of one of the drinks in Vinegar Week. So one of the ways to have your vinegar. It's called the Mother Apple Spritzer. And I wanted to make this drink because we're always talking about apple cider vinegar. And I thought, well, what about the actual apples? Like, nobody talks about them. They're the reason we have the apple cider vinegar. So this is an homage to the mother of apple cider vinegar. And as you can see here on the left, in the ingredients, we have little images of each ingredient. So cinnamon, you see a little bit of cinnamon, 1 tablespoon apple cider vinegar, you see the vinegar, ice cubes, there's a little photo of ice cubes, and finally half a small apple, there's a photo of that. And you see in the actual bullets, all the ingredients are in bold, right? So you can see very quickly, like step 1, I need cinnamon and ACV, etc. So again, this was just, I really care that you open a page and it feels like the simplest recipe you've ever seen in your whole life. And the feeling is, oh my God, I could do this right now, no problem.
It's amazing. I love it. I'm
Thank you.
such a huge fan of recipes. Design makes it easier to do things.
Yes, absolutely.
When things are beautifully designed, they're inviting, and you think about the function, you're like, wow, I get it.
Yeah.
I can do it.
Yeah.
So just as a previous life, I kind of had some training in design.
Oh, cool.
I have a lot of appreciation for the simplicity and the clarity.
And also
in the
simple is not
recipe.
easy, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what I've seen in my work as well. I started on Instagram showing my glucose graphs. And my intention was, how do I make this science visual? How do I make it so simple to understand that people grasp the concept in a glance? And that's where I started developing my glucose graphs. And I improved them over time, so that now you just get it in a second. But it's so much work to get to that point. You know, something like the simpler and easiest to understand it looks, the more work has gone into it.
It reminds me of a Steve Jobs quote. He would say, to get to a single yes, we have to go through 1,000 no's.
Yes.
And you are refining and you're pulling things out because it may look simple on the outside, but what you're really shooting for is you're looking for clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there's a lot of sophistication to make something clear.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate, you approaching your work in that way. And obviously you've put a lot of love into
Drew.
this
It's
recipe
beautiful,
book.
no? I love
Yeah,
it.
it's really beautiful. There's another one in the bottom left. Let's click on that one as well, that image. So talk about this one. What is this?
So this is from the section of the book that's after the 4-week method. So I have anytime main dishes and anytime desserts. So this is one of my favorite desserts. I'm a chocolate girl. I love my chocolate. This is my very simple chocolate mousse. And you just need chocolate, eggs, sugar, and berries. And I added this dessert section because I really wanted people to understand that apart from doing the hacks, you can do whatever you want. You can have dessert. We're not here to restrict anything. We're here to add the hacks like gentle giants in your life. And the rest of the time, because you're going to be off that roller coaster, you're going to be able to enjoy sugar in a way that gives you the dopamine and the pleasure, but without starting that addiction cycle. And so I love, this is probably one of my favorite images in the whole book. And you see my hand holding a strawberry on top of the mousse. And I cannot tell you how many shots we had to do before getting to that perfect shot. But I love it. And I can taste that chocolate mousse. It's really, really good.
You know what I love about this, and I think, one of the ways that the wellness community has gotten better is some of the fair criticisms that have come from people in what I would say is traditional dieting world, right? Even though there's plenty that, we might disagree with, and that's totally fine. I think everybody should disagree and debate and, may the best ideas rise to the surface. But one of the things that would often be the criticism, and I've definitely fallen in this trap. Like, I think you have to admit when you've gotten things wrong, and this is where I've gotten things wrong, is that some of the commentary previously is like, well, when things are made so complicated, and again, you're not doing this, I'm talking about my previous history and everything, like, hey, you got to watch out for gluten and then be careful about nightshades and this thing and that, I've definitely, because I'm talking about maybe some of my experiences, or every week a different guest comes on this podcast, and when a listener starts adding up all the list of things
like
that they
impossible.
have to do, they're like, how the fuck am I going to follow this, protocol?
Yeah.
And from the outside world, it's like, okay, well, all the research that's out there shows that what's the best diet? Well, it's the one that you can stick to.
Yes.
Right? And yeah, that looks a little bit more from a calories angle. And obviously we know the world is not just that, but the principle and idea is anything that you want to do, how do you reasonably stick to it? And being reasonable with it is that it is unfair to think that you're not going to have sweets in your life.
Oh, yeah,
right? We all have a sweet tooth and we're all going to crave those things.
Yeah.
It's more about having the right go-tos that allow you to enjoy it without feeling like you've completely fallen off the bandwagon.
Yeah.
And I always appreciate, since the first time I met you, your work really stood for that, is that I still will eat the pasta. I still will eat the things. I'll still have the dessert, but I'm practicing these base principles, which still help my glucose stay stable.
Yes.
And by the way, if I want to go to a restaurant and I want to try something new, I don't have any anxiety or fear that I'm going to mess everything up that I focused on.
Absolutely, Drew. And one of the most common pieces of feedback I received from my readers is that once they understood these concepts and they actually felt the impact, they were able to say goodbye to diets forever. All of a sudden, they're not scared of food anymore. So many people are scared of food, scared of carbs, scared of sugar. They feel guilty. They feel shame when they eat them. Now, with these hacks in place, you can basically go about your life as you wish, and you know you're helping your body by adding these few things a day. And to me, that's liberating. I want people to break free from these cycles of fear, shame, guilt, trying to do so many different things. Max Lugavere says something I love. He says, don't minor in the majors.
Don't major in the minors.
Yeah, but don't minor in the majors as well.
Don't minor in the majors.
So the majors are get some sleep, steady your glucose levels, move, get some sun. Don't minor in those. If you have completely unsteady glucose levels, but you're eating gluten-free and having a bunch of supplements, it's just not going to help you. You need to start with the core. The majors that many people bypass.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you feel like, oh, if I just take this pill, everything will be fine.
Totally.
Right? But actually, let's look at the majors first. And with these principles, you can get those right with very little effort and no restriction. And to me, that's why, honestly, I'm not tooting my own horn, but I do think this approach is really revolutionary because it helps you really master that blood sugar piece without doing anything crazy or overwhelming or cutting out any foods. And that's why I love it so much.
Yeah. I think, we already talked about it a little bit, but I'd love to spend a little bit more time jumping ahead, and then we'll come back to number 3, which is, a veggie starter. But movement feels like it's finally, maybe in the last 2 to 3 years, in getting the attention it deserves. And especially, or maybe it's just the sources that I'm paying attention to. I feel like it always felt like, oh yeah, okay, it's, get your movement in. But now there's many people
were talking about it just for calories. They're like, burn calories at the gym. But now we know that's not just that.
Well, there was that, right?
Yeah.
There was that world. But even in the wellness world, it's like just a good thing to do, but there wasn't as much of a deep understanding of how tied into longevity movement was, especially related to soaking up and eating all the glucose that's in the body, but then also related to grip strength
and preserving muscle,
and protecting your body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I was younger, I was growing up in France, and I remember being 17 and feeling like I signed up to this gym with my girlfriend, and I would just be like, oh, I guess I have to go to the gym this week. And I would go and spend 20 minutes on the treadmill and be like, oh, I guess, this way I'll be skinny or whatever. And just the relationship to exercise was so messed up. And I'm so happy that I was able to transition into a world where I actually love exercising now.
Yeah.
Because it helps my mental health so much.
And you feel it.
I sleep better. I feel strong. I just feel good. My brain works so much better when I move. And so I'm really happy we're seeing that shift out of, you're working out to burn calories.
Right.
Which, by the way, it's not a very effective way to burn calories, and exercise is not very linked to weight loss. Food is much more linked to weight loss if that's what you're after. But on the side of longevity, overall health, diabetes, brain health, mental health, inflammation, exercise is so powerful, Drew.
Totally.
And you probably know this. You've maybe said this a million times, but if we were able to put the effects of exercise in a pill, it would be the best-selling pill of all time.
Absolutely. So many times we hear about the next supplement or we hear about the next thing, but if, nobody's really looking at compared to what?
Yeah, spoiler alert, exercise is better.
Right. If you would look at that thing compared to exercise would blow it away.
Absolutely.
And just to add on to one thing you said, definitely the research shows exercise is not a good way to lose weight. That's diet. But once you have lost through diet, exercise is a great way to actually maintain your weight.
Nice.
So it's linked to the maintenance of weight.
And muscle is so important. and I lift like 3 times a week. I can tell you, I'm not bulky. Like, it's really hard for a female to put on a lot of muscle. And when I was younger, I was scared of weights. I would not touch them with a 10-foot pole because I was like, oh, I'm going to get really buff. But no, not at all. Like, I'm trying so hard to make my biceps bigger. Like, this is so impressive for me. I have like a little bit of a bicep now, but it's really hard to build muscle.
It's tough. If it was that easy, all the dudes that are out there that are training would be super ripped, You have to like fight. And the other thing that's there, and I credit a lot of people that have come on this podcast previously, Dr. Don Layman, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, really highlighting that after the age of 40, right? I turned 40 last year.
Happy birthday.
And thank you so much. And I was so excited to be 40. And then also understanding that every decade after 40, where you kind of hit your peak in terms of a lot of like the natural sort of growth hormones and things like that, for most of the population who's not eating healthy, not moving, you lose on average every decade 8% of your muscle mass.
I know.
Right? And it doesn't have to be crazy CrossFit workouts that help you maintain it. It's really adequate protein and regular movement. And really the movement piece, which is a big part of your hack. And yes, the next step up above, just normal walking is a great way to like balance your glucose levels that are there. And of course you mentioned strength training. If you want to preserve your muscle mass, you definitely need the strength training piece.
100%.
Right? And there's a lot of ways to get it that are accessible for individuals that are out there.
You wanted me to give you a tip for the strength training?
Please.
This is one of the ways you can complete the movement hack. So buy some dumbbells and keep them in front of your couch, like in your living room. And then after dinner, when you're watching a movie, you just grab them and you just like do some bicep curls, do some squats as you're watching the movie, because otherwise you're just sitting on your couch doing nothing. So it's about getting those in easy and fun ways. And then as you build muscle, you just feel so much better and you just want to keep that going. And
the crazy thing is, as you build muscle, you also have more tolerance for how much carbohydrates you can eat.
Absolutely.
I recently did my Boston Heart Labs. I'm working with this great cardiologist and we're kind of doing my updated labs and everything for my heart health and history with a little bit of family history of heart attack and, strokes and everything there. I'm trying to make sure I'm in the best place. And one thing that I've seen since I've been strength training, and I added about 7 pounds of lean muscle mass since I started in August of last year. And I definitely was under muscled, skinny fat, all those categories of what a lot of South Asians fall into. But as I've added that, my fasting insulin has stayed about 3, which is still in the optimal range. And I'm having actually even more carbohydrates than I ate previously. And my blood sugar is more balanced. So movement, what it allows you to do and the flexibility it brings to your life is nuts, on top of all the longevity things that all the longevity markers that it helps you solve for as well.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
So let's go back to your hack in number 4. So lifting and having some dumbbells, right?
Yeah,
but just watching
you can
TV,
do that. And
right?
I have lots of ideas of like different ways you can
let's run through
this.
a few of them if you want to share.
Okay, so that's a good one that I like. The calf push-up is especially good for people who are at the office and who just can't really like go for a walk or do anything. It's actually really powerful. So imagine you're in a meeting, in a Zoom call or something, you just put a little timer on your computer for 10 minutes and you do those calf raises as the meeting is going on for 10 minutes. That'll soak up glucose from your bloodstream and reduce the spike of that meal. Other than that, simple stuff like cleaning your apartment, doing the dishes, walking your dog, folding some laundry, and you can also do like a 10-minute YouTube dance video, whatever you want, whatever 10 minutes feels accessible to you. And actually, by the way, you might already be doing it. So in week 4, I ask people to just take a little inventory. Do you walk to work? Do you go for a little walk with a colleague during lunchtime? Do you go to the grocery store, etc.? You might already be completing that 10-minute hack. So sometimes you don't even have to add anything to your life.
People hear about visceral fat. It's often described other ways like deep belly fat, but some cool names that I like to refer to it as invisible obesity, because it's the kind of fat that you don't know about. So it's invisible, it's deep in your abdomen. Another term that I've heard that is, I'll give credit to, is Carl Lenore's Superhuman Radio. He calls it radioactive fat. And so it's this fat, from the concept that it actually has inflammatory properties. It's not really radioactive, but it's the notion that it has the ability to influence tissues outside of itself. And the way it does that, Drew, is through inflammatory molecules that it's constantly leaking and producing and sending throughout the body. So it's a proximity to the vascular system that allows it to be distributed throughout the body. And then it has this untoward inflammatory effect in all the tissues. So keep in mind, chronic disease, we hear about the common pathway of chronic disease is inflammation. And it's my clinical experience that visceral fat is behind all of that. I mean, it's got this association or causality yet to be proven in many cases to virtually every form of chronic disease. So one of the interesting things I like to let people think about when it comes to visceral fat is if you have a malady, a certain form of chronic disease, just go on Google or AI and Google, put in the search term whatever you have, comma, and then list visceral fat. The other technical term for it is visceral adipose tissue. Adipose means fat. So a variety of terms are used to describe visceral fat, but it is a really bad player because of its influence throughout your body. So I think that's a pretty good introduction to its association with chronic disease. And then anecdotally, I would like to share that I studied it for 7 years for the National Science Foundation, a grant that we received. And during that time, we looked at, in 6,000 people, their chronic disease, things that they identified as forms of chronic disease they were suffering. And as we focused on eliminating visceral fat in those individuals, all of their forms of chronic disease either got better or completely reversed. It was amazing as they got rid of visceral fat and to the extent they did. So symptomatology and conditions reverse better if you eliminate more of that visceral fat, and only partially improve if you just eliminate to a little bit. So that was absolutely shocking to see that something as profoundly connected to pathology and disease was never shared with me in medical school. We only learned about it through this study. But there's a lot of studies. If you Google visceral fat, and just like I invited people to go on Google or AI and look at its association with whatever condition they might be afflicted with, it's connected with so many conditions. It's been very well researched, but the problem is I've never seen something so valuable in the research lane kept from practitioners, physicians. It's inexplicable how something as powerful as this biomarker is kept from medical schools. The curriculums in medical schools are standardized. I went to both a law school, I'm an attorney as well as a physician. And I remember there are good law schools and bad law schools. But in the United States, there is no bad medical school. And that's because all the curriculum is set, and they're very, very good professional schools. The downside to that is because that curriculum is set and standardized, we don't have really good curriculum and not so good curriculum. So it's all kind of cookie cutter. And ubiquitous in all these medical schools is a lack of awareness about visceral fat and some of the other biomarkers that we learned about in our study for the National Science Foundation, in addition to visceral fat. So there's two images here, image on the top and image on the bottom. And when it comes to MRIs of the abdomen and looking at visceral fat, what you want to do is have the healthiest abdomen as possible. And the characteristics of a really healthy abdomen is generally it's oval shaped. So it's not protuberant. You don't have what you might imagine is what a dad bod might look like, a big barrel belly. You want a more oval shape. So take yourself back to when you were maybe 14, 15 years old, and you had a very oval shaped flat abdomen. That is the kind of abdomen you want to have even as an adult. And you want to see mostly dark. So in this image here, you see a lot of dark structures. And so on an MRI, muscle shows up as dark, and so do viscera, organs like the small intestine, colon, and bone. So this is the vertebral body. And this, by the way, are the psoas muscles, which are known as your core. So anybody watching that can see that, those are the buggers that hurt so bad when you do a core workout. And they're very important to health. Now, the white is anytime fat is present and an MRI scan shows up as white. This individual here has very little white, so very little visceral fat, contrasting it to the individual on the bottom. So this scan here is Asif, who's a friend of mine that I met at a gym, actually in a sauna, and a great guy. And I bought him this MRI to help him out. I just paid for it out of my own pockets to help Asif because he wants to go back and help poor kids in Bangladesh get educated. I'm like, gosh, I want to help this guy. And I could tell he had a lot of visceral fat, and he sure did. So this is a scan you don't want to be because it's mostly white. So if you ever get an abdominal scan, an MRI scan, you're going to have a real hard time getting it read. So it's good that you're watching the podcast today so you can learn about it. So you want very little white and you want mostly dark. And Asif is just filled with visceral fat. And then outside of his musculature is what's called subcutaneous fat. So that's just fat underneath the skin. And Asif has a lot of subcutaneous fat, but he predominantly is concentrated with visceral fat. And then Gabe, who's a friend of mine in the Army National Guard, has very little visceral fat, and he has a nice, healthy layer of subcutaneous fat. So he's got a six-pack, and that's his belly button, and these are his back muscles, and these are his obliques. And you want to have nice, dark muscles without a lot of fat streaks in it. Asif has these streaks of white in here. So this image here are both really important for your audience to understand the contrasting difference between healthy and unhealthy. We only see the outside of the body, but it's important, I think, to use an MRI to understand what else is going on the inside of the body. And having done this thousands of times now for people, it's very powerful to see what happens to somebody when they get to look inside their abdomen. It's almost like we can dismiss how we look in a mirror because we get accustomed to it. But it's like a magic looking glass. When you see inside your abdomen, you get a perspective you've never seen before. You're not accustomed to it. And so that's a really good chance for you to form new habits. And there's science behind this that if you change your environment and you're in a new environment, you can actually break habits and form new habits better just by being in a new environment. So I think what we're able to do is with an MRI, if you've never seen inside yourself, it's a little bit like that you go in an environment that you've never seen before, and suddenly you can now break bad habits and form new habits. And that's what we did with all these thousands of people in the National Science Foundation. We basically got them in a new environment, took them inside their body, and they broke their bad habits and formed good habits that they'd never been able to do just looking at their old familiar space.
Well, we're going to break down everything that you recommended for them, everything you do yourself. In fact, this is a great opportunity to do your before and after of you being on this journey. Can we bring up the photo that you have of you? So here's your before and after. Again, if you're listening on podcast, we have the link inside the show notes to this image as well that people can look at on our website. But describe it for them. And if you're on YouTube, you can see these before and after photos. So this is you on the left.
Yeah.
And what age is this?
So I'm 48 here. And in this particular image, I look pretty much like any other 48-year-old. I could walk by you in a shopping mall. I could take care of you. I'm an ER physician at that particular point full time. I could take care of you and you would not think anything of it. But what this face shows is the influence of visceral fat on my face. So it causes inflammation throughout your body and gives you this puffy, inflamed look to your face. And it's there basically showing we wear our health on our face. Probably more than any other feature in our body, our faces project and tell to our fellow humans how well we're doing at life. And really, how well you're doing in life is communicated by how healthy you are. So I look very average, but unfortunately, I am not healthy in this particular image. And then 10 years, 11 years later, my image on the right, which is just about 6 months ago, shows the dramatic difference where the face, the shape of my face has become much leaner. Now, lots of people lose weight, Drew, and it's really dependent upon the type of weight you lose. Maybe you lose muscle, and when you lose muscle, instead of losing fat, you don't have a favorable reflection in the appearance of your face. In other words, you don't derive a beneficial improvement in the appearance of your face if you are losing the wrong kind of tissue. But if you lose, and particularly, and the same applies with fat, if you lose visceral fat, your face looks much better than if you lose subcutaneous fat. So the MRI allows us to focus in on what is really harmful and what is beneficial. Superficial subcutaneous fat, and we can get into that maybe later, is actually beneficial, and visceral fat is very bad. So my profound change here is based on my, passionate 7 years of researching visceral fat and focusing on eliminating it in myself. And so I like to describe for audiences, I don't look like I'm 16, but the shape of my face has returned to the shape that I formerly had when I was about 16 or 20, because I had, at that age, much less visceral fat, and I didn't have the influence of visceral fat deteriorating my face. So what I tell people is, you won't ever look like you're 16 again, but the shape of your face can look more like you're 16 and 20. And so we should, improve the shape of our bodies, improve the shape of our faces, and the capacity to have a healthier looking face corresponds to your ability to be a better influencer. And that's part of our mission. Our mission in life is to live well and to be able to influence other people to live well also. And to the extent you're healthy, you're better at being an influencer.
For those that are listening on the audio, your face on the right-hand side, which is you now, definitely feels more features. It's less puffy. It's less inflamed. It obviously is clear that you look at your face, there's a shift. But interestingly enough, and we're going to come back to it later, you actually weigh more in the after photo. You weigh 178, which is, I'm guessing, your weight now. You're older and you weigh more, but you actually look younger and more youthful. We're going to come back to that in a second. But first, let's talk about the basics. What are the top drivers of visceral fat, and why is it such an explosion of visceral fat in our modern day society?
Yeah. So the big 5 things that we have found that contribute the most to visceral fat, based on our experience with the National Science Foundation and using this MRI to evaluate it, is first and foremostly processed foods. So when you eat a lot of processed foods, and maybe I'll just pull up this image here to support that you contribute to visceral fat. So let's demonstrate for those watching here the elimination of processed foods. If you simply only eliminate processed foods and you didn't do anything else, so you want to limit your confounders. In other words, we didn't do medications, we didn't do exercise, we didn't have this individual do a sauna, we didn't have them fast or anything else other than simply eliminate processed foods, processed carbohydrates in particular.
And just to be clear, we're talking about ultra processed foods, or we're talking about, because processed foods as a term can be kind of confusing to people. Some people will say guacamole is processed, right? But you're talking about, first and foremost, ultra processed foods.
Yeah.
But then also it sounds like you're talking about some minimally processed foods, especially when it comes to certain carbohydrates, right?
Yeah.
Like, are you talking about like pastas and other things like that?
Yeah, that would be included. So anything that really changes the form if it's not a natural process. So if you simply take an avocado and squash it and turn it into guacamole, that's a pretty natural process. But if you were to take something like wheat, grind it up, add some oils, and cook it that would be a lot more processing. So our guidance to individuals during the National Science Foundation was to only use natural kind of processed foods, squashing, changing the form with some kind of mechanical event as opposed to cooking or adding other ingredients into it. So we instructed this individual to eat food in whole form. So it would be meat and vegetables in non-processed form that he was allowed to eat. And he did that, and he had this amount of visceral fat on his baseline, meaning when he first got started.
Yeah, and so you just to describe again for the people that are listening on the podcast, you have basically a series of 6 images, and they go from week 0 all the way to week 35. So this is a sequential imagery, and the visceral fat here is this sort of yellow whitish imaging that's there. And you go week by week. You go week 0 to 2 to 5 to 15 to 25 and 35. So you sequentially see. And then next to it, you talk about how much the amount of visceral fat is. And is that in the total body or is that in the abdomen region? Like week 0, it says 5.6 pounds. Is that the total body or is that just in that area?
Just in the abdominal cavity. So the visceral fat would roughly include fat outside the abdomen around the heart. So that's organ fat too. And but it's quantified in this particular image through software that was captured and limited just within the abdomen. So this pinkish red color in the middle is your visceral fat. Your sub-Q fat is the yellow. We tracked and paid attention to the visceral fat because that is the more harmful substance.
Sorry about that. I got it wrong. The pinkish was the visceral fat.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Yeah, just adding some clarity to it. So you can see from in just 2 weeks, even though you are not a radiologist and many who are watching this and able to see that, they can visualize that the visceral fat, the pinkish substance has been reduced. And so that's an important observation to be aware of. And that happened just by this individual cutting out processed foods. But as you rightfully point out, over 35 weeks, this guy goes from having a dad bod, he's 68 years old, and he also has muscle with fat infiltrating the muscle. We call that adverse muscle composition, or myosteatosis, the technical term for it, where fat starts depositing within the muscle of your body. And by the time 35 weeks are up, this guy goes from a dad bod to looking like a collegiate swimmer. Look, he looks like somebody in his 20s. He's reduced his visceral fat that much. And he actually improved his musculature, and he did so without any exercise. So the elimination of visceral fat was profoundly facilitated by the elimination of processed carbohydrates in food. So you asked what causes visceral fat. That's a big one. And then I don't have an image of it, but a second one we get into is alcohol. So somebody that drinks, the more you drink, and I could have you start pounding, become, this heavy drinker. We're not going to see visceral fat for a while, but the more you drink, the more your metabolism is burdened and your capacity to have a healthy response to the caloric intake becomes compromised. So,
and is that generally because people who are drinking more are sort of also drinking their calories, right? So they're also getting just total excess extra calories, and that's contributing to visceral fat?
Well, the calories do make a contribution, but it's really more of its metabolic impact. Alcohol, when it's ingested, behaves differently because of its biochemical composition than any other forms of calories. So if you're ingesting fruit or rice or protein or meat or some other form, it's not going to have as much impact on your metabolism as alcohol. So we have our clients we recommend that they either cut back, scale back on alcohol, or completely eliminate it. And those that eliminate it completely have better results in eliminating visceral fat than those that continue to drink. And to the extent that you continue to drink, you become more resistant to the elimination of visceral fat. So somebody who comes back and has disappointing results between their scans, we will ask them about alcohol use. But for the most part, what's really interesting is people, when they get scanned, really are very, like I said earlier, very open to changing their lives more than any other time. So
because
the
they
MRI,
see it firsthand.
they do. And they say, I've never thought about giving up alcohol, but now I see that stuff inside of me. And they give up alcohol. They give up processed foods. And the third thing that causes visceral fat is impaired sleeping. So if they have a sleeping disorder, if they have obstructive sleep apnea, or they are apneic at nighttime, we bring this to attention, their visceral fat. Suddenly they get a lot more serious about using maybe their CPAP machine, or going in and getting evaluated for CPAP or obstructive sleep apnea, or they work on improving their sleep hygiene, becoming more attentive to how they may be impairing the sleep. A lot of people don't value sleep. They see this huge amount of visceral fat that they have inside of them. And so with that awareness, suddenly they start going to bed earlier. They start cutting out all the stimulation and other things. And that we could do, months of shows on sleep. But, suffice it to say that impaired sleeping has a major contribution to visceral fat. The fourth one surprises people, and it was a very interesting conversation that you had with Dr. Lustig is about stress. So stress causes, through the mediation of cortisol, the contribution and composition and deposition of visceral fat within the abdomen. And so individuals who unknowingly have stress in their lives, or who have stress in their lives but simply tolerate or put up with it, will be unfortunately accumulating unnecessarily a visceral fat inside of them, to the extent that they have it. Now, everybody's body is a little bit different, and some people respond to stress a little bit different. But to the extent that you can eliminate stress, you will eliminate the composition or deposition of visceral fat inside of people. So it's really an important discussion for people to be aware of. And then the final point that we see is, believe it or not, and and it came as a surprise, is durational exercise, where we simply exercise too much. And so we see that people that are runners, and I'll pull up a nice scan of this. Here's an MRI of somebody who's a marathoner who would run 8 to 10 marathons a year. He had a lot of this visceral fat within him, and he had this very small amount of subcutaneous fat. So we call these people with low subcutaneous fat on the outside TOFIs. So they're thin outside and fat inside. So this marathoner was filled with a lot of visceral fat. So we see, and it's probably two things. One, it contributes to visceral fat when you overexercise, and the exact mechanism is not clear. But my theory is it's probably through elevated reactive oxygen species, ROSs, that go around that are associated with exercise. If you exercise too long and too much, you enhance these ROSs from being produced. And so another example of this happening is a really nice before and after scan, and a 58-year-old executive of a company who came in, and he was having his repeat abdominal scan, his MRI. And
so this, for the audience that's listening, you have a before and after. It looks like they're taken about 2 months apart, right?
Correct.
And so on the left-hand side, for this individual that you mentioned, go ahead. You can describe it.
So on the left side is an MRI image of his abdomen, and he's got a substantial amount of visceral fat within his abdomen. His muscles look pretty good, and he was a pretty healthy guy. He was doing a lot of healthy things, 58-year-old executive. And this was a repeat itself. I don't have the MRI before it, but it was disappointing and alarming. So we asked him all the other contributions of visceral fat, and he assured us, and we were reassured by his answers, that he didn't have any of those other contributions. And here he disclosed to us that he was persisting in his running. He wasn't doing marathons. He was doing 10-mile runs 5 days a week, so 50 miles a week, which is a lot of running. As a consequence of all the running, he had a substantial amount of visceral fat that was staying there. And what visceral fat distance running appears to do is makes the elimination of visceral fat refractory. So not only does it seem to contribute to visceral fat, but when you start doing things like cutting out processed foods and sleeping better, cutting out alcohol, and then you have a harder time still getting the benefits of eliminating that visceral fat. So your body is resistant, holds on to that visceral fat more tenaciously if you're going to be doing distance running. So what we advocated and asked this guy to do was to substitute in for his distance running sprinting. And so this guy went from being a distance runner to a sprinter. And he did so in just 2 months. It was actually a little shy of 2 months. And look at the dramatic elimination of his visceral fat. So this image on the right now shows a lack of white, and he has much more dark present within his abdominal cavity. And then you can see the shape of his abdomen appears to be more oval, and he has a six-pack. And his muscles have increased. Nothing else changed in this, Drew, other than he simply substituted distance running for sprinting. And so we've seen this in numerous individuals who eliminate distance running and substitute in sprinting.
Distance running, like marathon runners,
they just
etc.
stop running. They don't do any more jogging. We recommend that they just simply do sprinting. It's a completely different form of exercise. I mean, it's hard to do. I'm a former distance runner. I ran cross country in school. I love distance running. I could not stop. I will admit to anybody in the audience today, I was addicted, in my belief. I was addicted to running. I loved it. And I loved the endorphins it produced. And I would run 70 to 90 minutes every single day. I could not stop doing this. And many people are like that. So for me, I stopped doing distance running. I started sprinting. I get my clients, patients that work with me to do the same thing, and dramatic improvement in the reduction of visceral fat when they start doing so.
So just to recap, we have the elimination of processed foods. We have the high reduction or elimination of alcohol. We have the doubling down on sleep and really making sleep one of the main focal points and prioritizations in your life. And of course, removing processed foods and greatly minimizing or removing alcohol both contribute to sleep. We have addressing the stress in our lives. And I have a few questions on that. I have a few questions on all these. And then the fifth one, which is people exercising too much, right? So let's start back up from the top. And before we get into processed foods and I get a chance to ask my clarifying questions on all of these, knowing my audience and the things that they're thinking about, remind us again, visceral fat and the elimination of it is not just about looking better. It's not just about having a more chiseled face or abdomen or other things. It's actually about reducing the amount of work that our organ systems have to do to process and function inside of the day, which is associated with longevity. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is correct. And you're wise to point that out. You know, our lives should not just be based on our looks. You want your lives to be reflected by the quality of your life. And to the extent that you can eliminate the disease process inside your body, you're going to live better. As a consequence of that fat being eliminated, you look better. But when it comes down to the most practical aspects to selling people on health, it's not just to look better. It's so you can live better. When you live better, you can influence more people and have a more positive impact on our species, on our planet, and our time here on Earth while we're alive. So the absence of disease really is an important thing. And the presumption, unfortunately, for most people probably listening today is that the process of disease is expected to accumulate as you age. And that's not the case. It really isn't. As if you make informed choices the majority of people are burdened today with an unnecessary amount of chronic disease. And so as they eliminate it through being enlightened about healthy lifestyle through your platform and other influencers that are doing this tremendous service to humanity to help people to become aware of both the need and how to become more healthy, we see disease processes leaving people. And so I'm passionate about the concept of challenging people that are older, that they don't have to continue to have disease. They can, feel better. They can have an improved quality of life. And that is the expected course of humans that I think defied many of our older ancestors for a long period of time. And today, with all of the contributions of bad food, stress, and chemicals and toxins in our environment, and really, I think you sum it up. And I have to mention it: the microbiome being so attacked and depleted. We have just the highest amount of chronic disease we have ever seen in the history of Homo sapiens today. And it continues to worsen. And in my opinion, it is the single greatest problem facing humanity more than anything else. And the reason why I say that is because nothing reduces human productivity more than chronic disease. Nothing costs more money than chronic disease. Nothing impairs the quality of living as much as chronic disease, and nothing kills more people than chronic disease. And who is talking about the biggest problem of humanity? Nobody. So I think it's important for social influencers to be discussing this huge problem. And I'd love for anybody to correct me if there's a bigger problem, because I'll abandon this one and work on it because I'm a problem solver. But for the time being, I have launched on reversing chronic disease, and I've centered in on visceral fat and these other biomarkers that are associated with it, so that in my remaining time, while I'm on this planet and I'm alive, I want to do my part to work on the biggest problem, which is chronic disease.
Well said. Is it fair to say that generally, the more visceral fat you have, the more likelihood that you are obese? Is that generally understood, that visceral fat and excess weight or obesity have some correlation with each other?
I think that's a fair assumption that a lot of people make, but I will tell you, as a practitioner in this particular space, it is not the case. We see many people who are patently obese, who have an appearance of a large body and have very small amount of visceral fat.
Wow.
And so those individuals have a technical term, and we call them FODIes. So they're fat outside and they're thin inside.
Which means that they have a lot of subcutaneous fat.
Yes.
But they don't have visceral fat. So
Yes.
What's going on with these individuals?
Yeah, what a great question. So there's a famous model who's on Sports Illustrated magazine, and she was quite controversial. I think her name is Numa. But she was a large woman, large girl. But if you look at her face, she has a very pretty face. Now, if we were to scan her, I would be willing to bet a substantial amount of some sort of a valuable thing to me that she is abundant. She has an abundance of subcutaneous fat and a paucity of visceral fat, not much visceral fat. And so if you have more subcutaneous fat and less visceral fat, you are going to be far healthier. And this defines, anatomically, what happens, the difference between men and women. So women during their fertile years before menopause kicks in tend to lay down more subcutaneous fat than men do. So they store their energy, their fat reserves in the form of subcutaneous fat and not much visceral fat. Men are the opposite. We tend to have much more deposition of visceral fat within us. And so as a consequence of a higher ratio of visceral fat to subcutaneous fat, we suffer more disease. And so men have the capacity for having heart attacks in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Women typically do not have a heart attack until they reach their 60s because of their physiological difference that they have specifically with visceral fat being deferred until menopause. So most of their, again, fat deposition is subcutaneous fat. But once you hit menopause, if you're a woman, you start accelerating your contribution of visceral fat. And so nature is no longer conferring this protective benefit upon you when you were reproductively fertile. And now you become expendable, sort of like us guys. Males are basically genetic contributors. We just contribute DNA. But women tend to have a greater importance to our species when it comes to rearing children. And that's something that we see a lot of in multiple species. And so it's no surprise that our particular species has that. As much as we might like to share in those responsibilities, and noble as it is, from a species standpoint, nature says, women have this, we're going to protect you. But then once menopause kicks in, you lose that and you accelerate your visceral fat and you produce more visceral fat as a woman, menopausal, faster than even men do. And so an interesting exercise, if you're listening, is to go in your photographs, women, and look at your female ancestors and watch what happens to their face right around menopause at the age of 50 to 55. That's when they become less attractive and their faces take on more inflammation and they get puffier. And I'm going to hit you right between the eyes if you're listening, because I want to exploit this in women. That is when the ugly button gets pushed.
Uh-oh, you might get a lot of emails.
I know. I'm just letting you know that if you want, and most women, it's important to our species, women want to look attractive. And so when you start accelerating your visceral fat and you don't know about it, you're going to lose your appearance. And it's important to women. You know, how you
versus
might,
guys who are ugly all along because they have so much visceral fat.
I think with us guys, we're less concerned about maybe how we might look in terms of attraction, except for maybe our physiques, our musculature. But to women, their faces are important to them. And during the Renaissance period of artwork, many of the masters would paint women that were a little bit heavy, cherubic, and use them as statues, figures for statues too, because of the abundance of subcutaneous fat that they had and the estrogenic effect that would come from these fats and causing really feminine, pretty faces. And then as they get older, they lose that, and their subcutaneous fat becomes replaced, starts going away. And women get thinner legs and they get big bellies. Now, women usually premenopausal have big thighs and buttocks, and they're more fertile looking in their appearance. So please don't think I'm trying to be critical of people's appearance and use that term ugly. I'm just trying to get you to aware of, if you are concerned about your appearance, that you should be concerned about visceral fat. But it's not just appearance. It's because your appearance tells the story about visceral fat being present. And when you have a dramatic change at menopause, you should understand physiologically what is happening in your body. I would like everybody listening to be aware of visceral fat and work to eliminate it, even, throughout their whole life, but particularly when menopause kicks in.
Why diversity of our gut microbiome is so integral to our health, reducing inflammation, feeling better, having regular bowel movements, having, even your mood be improved through a diversity of your gut microbiome.
Yeah. And I'm going to be a little disruptive in this conversation because I don't think it's just about the gut microbiome. I do think that we've got we have diversity of microbiomes to be talking about, whether it's the nasal, oral, vaginal, skin, eyes. We have so many, and they all need to have that diversity coming in. But we will talk about the gut. I do think that our food impacts a lot of those other microbiomes, though. So I just want to say that. And I also want to be a little bit disruptive in saying that my take on probiotics has changed a little bit as a result of this diversity message and all the things that I'm seeing in the science. Because what we really want to see, what I take away based on articles that I read, talking about the metabiome and really looking at the connection between the environment and our inner milieu, is that we need a diverse culture of bugs, not a monoculture, not 15 strains just plugging away every day, that large bolus. That's not enough. And I don't negate the therapeutic intervention of probiotics. If they have been tested, a particular strain for a particular condition, I think that that's great. But I think that the higher path is really to go after the milieu, the terrain, and to adjust that with prebiotics. And the other P, in addition to probiotic is polyphenols. You and I were talking about that a little bit before we got on the call or on this podcast. But I would say that it's really creating that flux and the constant interplay of having plant-based compounds from the diet that are diverse, interacting and creating a diverse gut microbiome. And then that diverse gut microbiome is actually taking those things like polyphenols and converting them into even more active metabolites. So it's like a full circle, right? We can get that gut microbiome in a diverse way working for us, where they then create more diverse phytochemical metabolites that come from the original compounds. So it's diversity upon diversity, if that makes sense. And, that's why it's so hard to get our arms around the phytochemical family tree, because it's not just the 10 to 25,000 different compounds in nature. It's what our gut microbiome is doing, in the best of all cases, to metabolize those phytochemicals into many different phytochemical metabolites.
And I think that even for a lot of people, so this understanding that, so let's just break it down as like a refresher. Not everybody knows what are phytochemicals, what are polyphenols, and then what's the mechanism that they would be impacting the gut bacteria, right? People know about probiotics, and they know that certain probiotics, can maybe spearhead a certain strain as long as you're taking them. And then other probiotics could potentially, or prebiotics could help cultivate your body's own, beneficial bacteria. But I think a lot of the understanding around phytochemicals and polyphenols, people are just trying to imagine, like, how does that connection work, or mechanism that they actually influence the gut bacteria to do positive things in the body? So what are phytochemicals? What are polyphenols? And then what's the mechanism that they influence our gut bacteria on?
It's really good that we unpack this a bit. Okay, so let's do a phytochemicals 101. Sometimes phytochemicals are called phytonutrients, so I may use those terms interchangeably. In nutrition science, we have the macronutrients, protein, carbohydrate, and fat. They all give us calories, and that's where many nutritionists spend their time is, okay, are you on a low fat, low carb, low protein? All the nutrition wars seem to be around the macros, right? And then we have the micronutrients, which are vitamins, fat-soluble, water-soluble, and minerals. Macrominerals, microminerals, ultra-trace minerals. It's like a whole universe unto itself. And then separate from that are phytochemicals. So these are very specific plant-based, hence the word phyto, plant. So they're derived from plants. And it's an expanse that goes beyond even the amount of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, vitamins, and minerals. We have here these, and many people would say, well, they're non-nutritive. They don't give calories. They just make food look pretty. Well, what we're finding,
which means that they're not essential, but here you're about to jump in, and what? Yeah,
so they may not be seen as essential, and it's hard for people to relate to them because you don't find them on a nutrition facts label. And the closest you can get to something from the plant is usually dietary fiber. But you don't see on the label flavonoids, carotenoids. I mean, you might hear about beta carotene in carrots, but we're talking thousands and thousands of compounds. And I don't even think that we've actually keyed into the whole array. We haven't even identified all the ones that are out there.
That's why sometimes people call it like the dark matter of the nutrition world.
Yeah, I like that terminology, although I would see it as the rainbow matter, but yes.
Dark in the sense of it's invisible, but of course, as you're
Yes.
sharing in here, it's actually visible.
It is visible. I mean, each of these colors connects to a certain wavelength of light, right? That's what makes them, we think of infrared or red has a certain wavelength or spectra to it.
And you're talking about the reds in basically plant foods and
Correct.
nutrients. So tomatoes,
Yes.
raspberries.
Cranberries, strawberries. However, even though we would talk about red foods, there can be different phytochemicals within each of them. There are some staple phytochemical families that you find in those, but you can find differences, which is why we need variety even within a color.
And let's even go back a little bit more so, because a lot of people don't understand the connection between plants having colors and that signaling something around their environment. So what was the role, before we even come back to humans and the mechanism of the gut microbiome and how phytonutrients and polyphenols impact it, how did plants evolve, or what sort of evolutionary process is like, what role do these phytochemicals play inside of the plants?
So it's so interesting to look at our rods and cones, the ability of the eye to see color and how different animals, different species can see different colors. And the idea is that, and I'm I would say in terms of looking at all the animals and what they can see, but I do know that in general, with humans having certain numbers of cones and certain combinations of that red, green, and blue, that we're able to make these color compositions and to identify them in nature in order to, we might think to ensure our survival. Like we might see certain things in nature, like a red berry, and we would think, oh, there's a food supply, right? Color keys us into our survival. And for that reason, I often like to say that color is medicine, color is healing, color is psychological, it's physiological, and especially red. Red is that color of urgency, emergency. I mean, look at a stop sign, an ambulance, a stoplight. So in nature, seeing red might catch our attention. There might be some reason why we see that food as red.
And for a lot of plants, these phytochemicals, from my understanding, and feel free to toss in any layer that you have on top of it, is like these are their defenses. These are their survival components. Human beings can run, we can fight back, and, we can go to a different destination. Plants don't have that ability. So when it comes to their ability to reproduce, when it comes to their ability to ward off, and it's not just animals, it's ward off infection, bacteria, other opportunistic plants in their area. These phytochemicals and their ability to evolve over time and bring in these defenses made them more resilient. I think about the classic example, we mentioned him earlier, Dr. Jeffrey Brand, one of the fathers of functional medicine. He is really big into this Himalayan tartary buckwheat. And this buckwheat, the story is that this buckwheat has so many phytochemicals inside of it because growing in the Himalayas at high altitude and having to survive in extreme environments was a big part of why it developed all these resources around it. Anything you want to add to that?
That was brilliant. That's exactly spot on, right? This is the whole concept of xenohormesis. Xeno meaning foreign and hormesis meaning balance or a sense of homeostasis, if you will. So taking the environmental concepts of what's coming through and then responding accordingly. Now, that could be seen as stress, because if you think of something that would be seen as a threat, whether it's a pest or it's really hot or it's very moist or, like you said, with the altitude being high, less oxygen, those could be seen in our lives as stressors. However, for the plant, because they have the genetic machinery that allows them to acclimate, they can create the metabolites that will ensure better survival for them because they can't move, just like you said, right? And they're smart, smarty plants.
Yeah. And I think about it as I went to wine country in Argentina. It's this famous region, Mendoza, right? Where a lot of the Malbec and other stuff comes from. And we were at this organic vineyard and they were talking about how they, practice dry farming and organic and everything else with the wine. And it sounds so basic, but they were like, there's a balance that's here as we're growing these grapes. Good wine is not grapes that have been left to be too lazy. They're overfed. They have all the nutrients. They have everything that they need. They have all the water that's there. And then on the flip side, we don't want to give them nothing because then they shrivel up and, they get eaten. So we want them right in the middle with the right healthy dose of stress because that creates strong grapes, and strong grapes turns into this incredible flavor that we all enjoy. Same thing with us as human beings. We want to have, our opinions in a way challenged. We want to have other people say, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Have you ever thought of this idea? Like when somebody challenges you, it's like debate class. It's like you learn, even if that makes your opinion or idea about how the world should run better. Or you might change your mind and have a different perspective. Or for human beings, we have exercise, right? Exercise is an inflammatory process. It makes, I wear a continuous glucose monitor. Your blood sugar shoots up a little bit, but that is good stress and good stimulation to you. So in that same way, both for the plant kingdom and for us, we want to have those stressors that are there. And I think of corn. I think about this monocropping, soy. I think of corn, soy, and the standard sort of, farming practices. I see those as like lazy crops. And the animals that are eating them are also sort of, quote unquote, lazy animals because we're trying to reduce all the different things that are there and have them live one way, eat the same thing, and they're unhealthy. And then we eat those things and we become unhealthy.
Spot on. And just to circle back to diversity and foods and the variety, that's exactly what we're doing is we're cultivating resilience by allowing the body to have that particular kind of micro stress, if you will. So when we see different things over and over again, it's like, oh, we have to respond. We have to be intelligent. We have to be intuitive to that response. It's not something that we get kind of lazy and we're doing the same thing every day with the same food. We have oatmeal every day of our lives for 70 years and then we wonder why we don't feel good, right? So I do think that what we're talking about here, I'm glad that you took us down this path because you talking about xenohormesis, this is representative. What happens with plants is something that we would want to mimic as humans.
I'm reading these notes that you put together in front of the interview, and I have all these little gems that are here. One that I'm going to pull out here, gut microbial diversity is associated with lower arthrital stiffness in women. Talk about how that even could be connected. That seems like you pulled that from one of your studies. You're deep in the research that's out there. How does that happen that somebody might have lower arthritis? In this case, we're talking about women, but probably it translates for men too, and how that could be linked to the diversity in the gut microbiome.
So actually, that is arterial stiffness. I might have a typo.
I think I read it incorrectly. Sorry.
Okay. So that study was looking at an association between the gut microbiome and heart health, arterial stiffness. So like, how flexible your arteries are. And there was another study that showed that systolic blood pressure could be improved by having 8 or more diverse food items per day. That's just really amazing to me that our heart health could be impacted by variety, by diversity of those foods. So how does that work? Let's go back to the gut microbiome because what we're seeing is that ancestrally, we probably had access to something like, it's been postulated, something like 3,000 different plant species. And right now, we might have access to 300, but the average person is selecting from about 100. And I would say that's probably on the high side. And I'll cue you into like a way to assess one's variety and some work that I've already done in that area where, people are not always even at that 100 level in a week. So based on that, if we can bring in more diverse organisms as best we can, even to that 400 level in a week, perhaps we create a more robust gut microbiome, and the gut will change signaling molecules to things like our vasculature, to our heart. And I mean, I just got off of a conference right now just teaching on nutrition and cardiovascular health. I'm glad that you asked about this, actually, because there is a link. The gut is connected to the heart, is connected to the brain, and everything is interconnected. And when I think about having diversity in those three respective big areas, we even have this term metabolic flexibility in the literature, the ability of the body to be able to switch from carbohydrate to fat in terms of metabolic activity. So again, having that variety enables us to produce what we need, perhaps metabolically, and give our gut a sense of resilience, which then works upstream.
You mentioned this term signaling molecules, and I think that's going to be new for a lot of folks. Some people have heard about it, but these, and I don't know the full spectrum of them, but one of them that I hear often and that people have discussed on this podcast are that your gut bacteria produce these metabolites. And in exchange for us feeding them prebiotics, a diversity of foods that are out there, different herbs, things that contain all these incredible phytochemicals, polyphenols, they then release these compounds. And I want to know if there's more than metabolites. If you know anything about the subject, feel free to chime in. And then that goes into our bloodstream and is basically telling different things in real time on how to modulate. Is that an example of epigenetics in real time?
I don't know if it's an example of epigenetics, but I would see it as the system's web, the body connecting through the gut. Let me just give you an example. As you relayed that, one of the things that came to mind is maybe not everything needs to be absorbed, but has an effect. So let's even talk about turmeric, one of the hottest herbs, spices, medicinals. Turmeric on its own is not very well absorbed, even at higher amounts. And often what is done is that turmeric is modified in some way through the addition of oil and dietary supplements. There are various preparations that maybe there are phospholipids or different kind of fats in order to enable it to slip on through to get better absorbed. I have a general feeling or a sense of this that maybe not everything needs to be absorbed in order to have an effect.
Sure.
Maybe that turmeric is being worked on by the gut microorganisms to produce secondary compounds that then can get in naturally without any modification and then have that system-wide effect. One of the things that I have seen in the literature is serotonin. We know that the gut makes so many things just on its own, and yes, potentially through those gut microorganisms. And serotonin that is made in the gut can actually signal and crosstalk with bone. So we can create different changes throughout the body just by having that initial, as you called it, the signaling molecule from the gut. One of the hotter ones today, I would say, would be the short-chain fatty acids. When we think of prebiotic fibers and different things, fermented foods, I think of the short-chain fatty acids. My PhD was all on fatty acids, and I often think about how fats don't get the respect they deserve. There are so many different families, and they all have different personalities. Once you're born as just colloquial speaking, but once you are brought into the essential fatty acid family as a compound, you will always be within that family. There is no crossover where you're going to become a part of a different family. So with the short chain fatty acids, what is intriguing is that there are a variety of them, whether acetate, butyrate, propionate, and these are often metabolites of these fibers that we take in, and then they signal through the body, but they can also change the gut milieu to change pH. They may change pH in such a way to change immune modulation or even to change inflammation. They can also change mineral uptake. I don't know if you saw the study somewhat recently, I think it was in the summer, showing how the gut microbiome can change mineral absorption and really have an impact with just nutrients. So if we keep, I guess the takeaway from all of this would be, if we can keep our gut microbiome happy and in check, our entire system web, our heart, our bones, our brain, everything about us can stay in a healthy balance. But I don't think it's limited to the gut. I really do think that we're on the horizon. If we think about the next year and where we're trending, I think one of those trends is really looking at the skin microbiome. I think the skin is great, big, huge, because you see similarities between the gut and the skin, the tissue. So I'm curious what will evolve in terms of technologies. Dr. Rob Knight is so good. He's a researcher who has done a lot in terms of looking at the different microbiota on different parts of the skin. I remember listening to one of his lectures. I mean, even the face had, and I'm no expert in this area, somebody like him would be, but basically you have different microorganisms on different parts of your face, and they reside there. That's just where they hang out. So how can we get, again, more diverse and expansive in our conversation about the gut microbiome? I think I'm really excited to see where else it's going to take us.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about serotonin, when you understand that and the role that the gut plays, and who knows what else as we start to go deeper down the rabbit hole, you can start to make sense of headlines like, here's one headline in the notes that you sent over to me. Dietary variety is associated with lower odds of feeling worried, sad, or unhappy as studied in fifth graders. I think about the standard school lunch, and it's kind of like the maximum diversity that they tend to have at most places. There are some schools that are doing very innovative things that are out there. The maximum diversity is like, okay, great. Wednesday's pizza day, Thursday's chicken nuggets, Fridays is burgers, and by the way, pizza's a vegetable, right? So that's how we're going to get like the vegetable quota that we need to get in as a school. And you see a rise in anxiety amongst kids. You see a rise in so many different mood disorders that are there, and a general sense of feeling like a disassociation with the world. And is it to say that this is all as simple as a diversity in the diet? No, but we're talking about a diversity of all things. But I do a balancing act, because yes, everything matters. Of course, sleep matters, exercise matters, and other stuff. But largely still, diet is one of those things, like you see an amazing change right away. So I do want to say, yes, everything matters for sure. And we need to look at all aspects. But sometimes the diet today is so undiverse, so processed, that it has such a negative impact on people. And I think in this instance, probably a huge impact that it's having on kids.
It is. I have some ideas around kids, because this is one of the biggest concerns that people have when they come to me. Deanna, how can I get my kids eating better? So let me just talk about some of the research findings and then some tools that I think could help people. First and foremost, this message of dietary diversity, and even in infants, there are some studies showing that when an infant, has greater introduction of foods earlier in life, that they can see decreased rates of things like allergy and asthma and atopic diseases. So dermatitis and things of that nature. So what does that translate into? That's telling me that a child with an immature immune system can be best benefited by having more diverse foods to help to create a more resilient, robust immune system, to give them a better chance against some of the immune type conditions that they may be set up for, whether environmentally or genetically. So, and I know that your sister just had a baby. And so I was thinking about her as I was thinking about all this research, like, wow, it would be so great to let people know that more diverse foods earlier on in life could actually impart greater resilience to that child long term. So there's that. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how do I get my child to actually eat more diverse? They won't. They have texture issues. They have sensory issues. So some of the studies, and this is really interesting, and I've actually seen this borne out with some kids, greater presentation of more varied foods. Let's just take vegetables. So if I gave a 5-year-old peas, carrots, and beets to choose from, they would end up having more collectively of all of those vegetables compared to if I just gave them peas. You know what I think it boils down to? I think it's locus of control. it's kind of like, oh, this looks interesting, and maybe the different colors and the different tastes. And even if they could take a little bit from each, that's what you want versus just piling on the plate.
Here's this half pound of spinach. I need you to eat this now.
Eat it now. Yeah. No, and to involve them in it, to give them that sense of locus of control, I think is really important. One of the tools that I created it's very simple. Nothing like, it's not so scientific outside of like being like a rainbow bingo for kids. Rather than having kids focus on nutrition. So when I was very young, my mom focused on nutrition, and it really wasn't the hip, trendy thing to do. She was kind of a health nut in the way of being very new to thinking about food and nutrition. And so, it wasn't fun to have to read labels at the age of 9 and to know what mono and diglycerides were and to say, oh, I can't eat that because of these things. So what I have done is rather than focus on the negative with food, especially thinking about kids, focus on the fun and the positive. What will make them want to be at that table eating the food? So colors, creating a very simple rainbow type bingo exercise where for 7 days, you have the 7 colors listed out and they just put an X whenever they have in the box for when they have matched that color with their food. Super easy, right?
Super easy.
And it just really cues people, especially kids, into all things color. And when I have done this with adults, what I have seen is that when they wake up to colors of their food, now all of a sudden their mood starts to change. They begin to wear different colors. They start to put different furniture in their living rooms. There was one woman who participated in one of my colorful food type programs, and she was working in an office cube that was gray. And so she showed us pictures of how she put up banners and color, and she decorated her cubicle to make it more inviting. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you're tuned into color, it's like, wow, I'm seeing it everywhere. So I do think that helping kids earlier on is so important because when they frame up their palate at that point of being very young, that's going to set the stage for later. And they're watching you. They're watching us as adults to see what we're eating. And that's something that we see in the literature as well. Mothers and daughters especially. So we can't say, a mom can't say, hey, you need to eat this, but then the mom doesn't do it. So the way to cultivate variety and to ensure better outcomes for our kids is to actually do it ourselves. And that's a good thing, right?
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
have families doing the health practice.
In addition to kids, I'm sure people come to you all the time because everybody is in different stages of their life and is juggling a lot of different things. Some people are working multiple jobs. Some people are just trying to figure out how to survive as a mom, whatever it might be. So people are often thinking, as is baked into our evolutionary history, human beings look for shortcuts, right? Yeah. And it's a big part of how we ended up where we ended up. Even our need for concentrated calories has come out of the shortcut of us making sure that we can feed our brain and get what we need to do, because we don't want to spend any more effort and energy looking for food than we need to. I think sometimes people think of like hunter-gatherer ancestors as like intentionally going out and maybe looking for diversity. And I think in some cases it was an entire, village of people. So some people had different jobs and food was so central into our lives, right? So we put a lot more effort and energy into it and we had to do it. And then the seasons changed. So we were forced to do it, right? But I don't know necessarily if anybody was purposefully, on an ongoing basis, exceeding extra calories simply for the sake of diversity. It's that they knew that they got an end result on the end of it. They'd be less likely to get sick that winter. They'd be more likely to survive. Or in the case of fruits, just like we just had Dr. Robert Johnson on the podcast, who's done all this incredible work on uric acid. And I don't know if you're familiar with his research, but one of the things that he was talking about, he's like, fruit, especially, these plants pump all this sugar into these different fruits that are there. And they signal to us like, hey, eat me, eat me, eat me. We eat it. We end up spreading their seeds. And especially where fruit ends up blossoming and becoming ripe, because a lot of animals will not eat the fruit until it's ripe. It doesn't taste like the thing that they want. It's late summer, early fall. And then in return, we're sort of piling on and beefing up our uric acid, which has a store weight. And so that we could survive through the winter. So there's all these like benefits that we get And so here's where I was going with all this, is that when people are trying to juggle a lot of things, do you ever get the question of what is the minimum viable or the shortcut hacks that I can do? If I can only do a couple things that are there, what are those things that I can do to make sure that I'm still getting some diversity in the diet, right? You never want to shortcut something so much so that you undercut the core premise of the idea that's there. But are there a few things? You gave us some tips for kids. Are there a few things for adults that are listening today?
Yes, there are. But before we get into tips, I first want to say that we all have to figure out what is our motivation, right? And if we want to feel better, we want better mood. Just want to go back to what you were saying about fruits, because it made me think of some of the research on fruit. I think people, for the most part, what I see is that people are fruit phobic. They're even fruit and vegetable phobic in many ways. They say, well, what about those anti-nutrients, those lectins and those oxalates? And, they go through that whole battery. But there's a great review article that was looking at whole fruits and looking at the research, simply looking at, and it wasn't just looking at reduced risk of chronic disease, because we our eyes glaze over when we think about that as our motivator. Is that really a motivator? We might feel so far away from something like that. But some of the research on fruit and even vegetables, but let me just focus on fruit for a second, is that the number of servings of fruit that we have is correlated with better life satisfaction. There is a sense of, and in fact, just even at the conference I was at, I presented showing vascular aging was correlated with number of servings of fruit. So the more that we had the fruit servings in our lives, the less vascular aging we have, or at least has been shown in this literature. So fruit is signaling something to us. I guess, when you have uric acid as a metric, but let's just take it even broader into seasons for a second.
Please.
Because this is a place where diversity enters in, and there's some interesting animal research going on where they take animals that have been acclimated to a short day period, so more like winter, and then a long day period, so more like summer. And then they give them fruit. And there was one particular study where they looked at oranges. The oranges were either grown in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. So the animals had different diurnal rhythms, right? They were seasonal. From a seasonal perspective, they were different. When they were given the oranges from two different hemispheres with different phytochemicals, differing by about 39 different phytochemicals, what they showed was that the animals that were given the summer orange that were mimicking the winter months, that they actually exhibited a more, I would say, a fattier phenotype. So they tended to put more fat on. Now, that doesn't mean I just touted and extolled the virtues of fruit. And then I said, but if you have an orange in the winter, you may actually put on more fat. Well, this was in the study where they had concentrated amounts. And
Sure.
I don't think, as long as we, again, diversity and that we're changing things up.
Right. What I'm hearing from what you're sharing is that food is information. And
Yes.
so when we're doing our best to eat seasonally, and when we're doing our best to include that diversity, we're not overdoing any one particular food. And especially in the case of fruit, it's like, I think that we went one degree where people talking about keto and fruit phobia and other stuff. And I think it's coming back, especially with all this literature on phytochemicals, polyphenols, and other stuff, that as long as we're not overdoing fruit juice, which is a different sort of
Yes,
thing.
that's different. Mm-hmm.
And we're sticking to this whole fruit, and we're mixing up the diversity, so it's not always the same oranges all the time, and it's diversity of our whole diet as a whole. We can get the benefits of all these different things. How do you feel about, so one of the hacks that I have, in addition to I have whole foods diet, and I've definitely broadened my diet because, like you, I kind of was immersed in the world of the elimination diet, and I would often recommend that to a lot of people that were there. And one thing that happens for people in the health world, that are probably a lot of folks that are listening to the podcast, is that you naturally first, when you take out things like gluten and dairy and other stuff, that especially if they're processed forms that we especially rely on here in America, different than Europe and other parts of the world, you tend to feel better. You tend to feel better because those things were not really meant for health food for us today, or they've been so bastardized that they're completely different from their natural forms of, I think about, My business partner was in Sardinia, hanging out with the Sardinians over there, and they eat cheese all day long. And they're taking their goats and their sheep and they're having them feed on all these different things like rosemary and all these different herbs. And that's how they say that they season their milk and their cheese before they even put it on the table, as they get these goats to eat all these different herbs and things like that are out there. And we're not doing that with, the cows that we have here in America that are primarily eating corn and Skittles. That's the only rainbow that they have, is Skittles that they have access to, unfortunately. So where I was going with this is that in my life, in addition to eating a whole food diet and pulling back, because when you do the elimination diet and you initially feel good, then you're kind of scared a little bit. Some people are like scared to go and add additional things and to figure out how to have diversity. And as a byproduct, we had a friend of ours, Sean Stevenson, on the podcast a few months ago, and he said that he had gone so down the rabbit hole of a restricted diet that anytime he tried to eat other things outside of it, initially he'd feel like a little bit of bloating, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And he had to work with a nutritionist to help him mindfully expand his diet. And that meant including in things that he never thought he would eat before, like beans, and that actually made his gut microbiome a lot better off that was there. So for me, I've broadened my diet from being a lot more elimination diet focused, and I try to include a lot of different things. And my whole point in travel is to try to go and try different foods in a different area that are, whole foods that are there. So one hack I have in my own life is because I know that we don't want to overdo anything, and I'll have these different freeze-dried organic powders that are there that have like no sugar content inside of them from all different companies and brands that are out there. And I will try every day a different version of those in my low glycemic, smoothie that I'll mix with fat and unsweetened almond milk and other things like that. And, what are your thoughts on that? I'm not saying that's the only place that I'm getting things from, but it's just another way of me adding in variety inside of my diet.
Why not?
I think it's very important that we don't conflate the ideas of insulin resistance and weight gain. That the fact that a body is gaining weight actually suggests that the fat cells are insulin sensitive. Now, there are so many thoughts that I want to express here that I'm going to try to make it a very cohesive line of thinking here. You really can't appreciate whole body insulin resistance without appreciating the origins of it, which I believe are very firmly at the fat cell. There are, every tissue is responsive to insulin, and as it becomes insulin resistant or not would contribute to whole body insulin resistance. But in your case, we have a guy whose fasting insulin levels are good. My counter would be, what were your insulin levels throughout the day when you aren't fasted? That's where I think we have to appreciate this. Where Drew was on vacation and where Ben was on vacation, because I experienced very much the same thing coming back from this wonderful European trip with my family, definitely chubbier than when I left. And I don't have a full head of hair like you do, Drew, to kind of mask it. If you got a bald, chubby guy at the beach, you just see a bald, chubby guy. I don't have a beautiful head of hair to, act as at least you can say, give me some kind of compliment. It's just a pasty, freckled, bald, chubby dude. So I was very mindful of that. And have been just like you. So now, whereas you and I are still generally insulin sensitive, and we have a fasted insulin that falls in a normal range, and indeed a range that I would consider good, what was happening from sun up to sundown when we weren't fasted? And that's where so many people have the problem, where we have such a culture of carbohydrate heavy foods and eating so frequently that the average individual, certainly when Drew and Ben are on vacation, spends almost every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And we're still insulin sensitive enough that after a 12-hour fast, our insulin comes down. But what happens in those other 12 hours during the day, or more than 12 hours, depending on what we eat before we go to bed, when our insulin is elevated? We have such a culture globally of focusing on carbohydrates as the primary source of calories, and often very refined carbohydrates, and eating every 2 or so hours. So we never actually give insulin a chance to come down, right? When insulin's starting to come down, we spike it right back up. That is how we can gain weight and yet still have a nice fasted insulin number, again, when we are fasted. But the net effect, there was a paper published in Humans that had people overeat carbohydrates for 7 days. So it was a high carbohydrate diet for 7 days. And at the end of the 7 days, the fasted insulin was 2.5 times higher. So I would say the bill comes due that maybe that you or I, in your case, because you were measuring your fasted insulin so readily, it wasn't enough to actually start promoting a more lingering insulin resistance, but we know it happens. This just in as short as 1 week, the fasted insulin went from around 5 microunits per mil up to high teens in these people, again, in a fasted state. And that just means in that case, even when you are fasted, you have gone into the realm of what scientists at University of Pittsburgh identified years ago called metabolic inflexibility, which is basically just you're insulin resistant and your body now is having a hard time shifting to fat burning, even when you're fasted, even when you should have gone to fat burning. The body's a hybrid, burning glucose or fats primarily. And insulin is the switch that determines which fuel the body's using. And so that is, again, when fat gain would start to amplify, where you're not only gaining fat during the day, but you're potentially not turning to fat burning during the night, when you should be, which would be helping with some degree of fat loss. You're still potentially storing fat even when the body wants to be burning it. But let me just revisit the role of the fat cell very briefly. And this is a particular interest with two guys like me and you. You have Ben Bickman, who is kind of European, Northern European descent, and I have Drew. I think you're South Asian.
Indian, yep.
You're yep. So these are two remarkably comparable ethnicities. When I did my postdoctoral work in Singapore, one of the reasons Singapore was so interested in partnering with Duke University, which is where I was to understand these ethnic differences on how you can take ethnicities, particularly in Singapore, with both Chinese, South Asian, Malaysian, and European. And you have these 4 different guys who are best drinking buddies, and they're all gaining weight, and yet they start to suffer the consequences of that weight gain at very different rates. But a study done in Caucasians compared to South Asians, not only do we know that the average South Asian Indian has a fasted insulin that is more than double what his Caucasian counterpart is, but also, even at the same body weight, his fat cells are about 3 to 4 times larger than his Caucasian counterpart. And there are these, and this could explain why partly India has more people with type 2 diabetes. Absolute numbers more than anyone, but of course India's population is so massive. Even per capita, it's approaching the number 1 spot in the world, being truly the diabetes capital of the world. And a part of it is this combination, yes, environment, diet matters, but also genetics. And so that is, it's very much important for us to understand what we could call the personal fat threshold, that based on our genetics and partly our diet, certain bodies have the potential to store fat in their fat cells to varying levels. And just Caucasians, in the case of this example, appear to have the higher threshold. But basically, as long as you can continue to store fat in fat cells, the body stays metabolically sound. And that it's once the fat cells start to reach a point of maximum dimension, and by that I mean every individual fat cell is getting too big, now the body has reached its threshold. And if insulin is attempting to still tell the body to store energy, now you have a war, a metabolic mutiny, where the fat cell starts to rebel. So we gain fat through 2 different processes. You have 2 buddies, 2 college, you have Drew and Ben. We're going on vacation, hanging out together, and we both come back from our trip 10 pounds fatter. Because of our unique ethnicity and the genetics that come with that, some of my weight gain potentially would have happened through some modest degree of hyperplasia, where when my fat cells started to get a little big, I would simply create some new fat cells. Whereas Drew, with South Asian ethnicity, your fat cells, you have a very limited potential for hyperplasia. In other words, you're not going to multiply your fat cells. The number of fat cells is pretty set. So then what happens is the fat cells each just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So each fat cell is carrying a bigger metabolic load than it would normally. Whereas again, in another body that can undergo hyperplasia, the fat cell gets a little big and it recruits a new fat cell, which gets a little big. So more important than the mass of fat we have on our body is the size of each individual fat cell, which of course is impossible to measure outside of a lab. We can do that thing here in my lab by taking biopsies of people's fat tissue. But even still, it's not something you're going to really do. That's why you start to look at these other markers that we mentioned. But to sort of wrap through this idea quickly, when the fat cell gets really, really big, two problems start to happen. One, it starts to reach a point of maximum dimension that it can't grow anymore. Otherwise, the cell membrane starts to lose its integrity and literally start to pop, which would be a very messy, inflammatory process. And at the second, the fat cell, as it's swollen up to 10 or 20 times bigger than it used to be, is now suffocating. It's getting pushed too far from capillaries. In other words, blood vessels where it can get oxygen and give it CO2 and get nutrients. So the fat cell starts to get too big and it starts to suffocate. This elicits two responses. When the fat cell starts to get so big, it starts to tell insulin, you are trying to make me big, and yet I can't grow anymore. And so while you are trying to block me from breaking down my fat, I'm not listening, and I'm going to start leaking fats. To say that in a more precise term, insulin normally inhibits lipolysis, which is the term for breaking down fat. That's the primary mechanism whereby insulin promotes the growth of a fat cell, not necessarily force feeding it, but preventing it from breaking it down. So the fat cell says, insulin, fats are still coming in, or glucose is still coming in, but now I'm going to start breaking down fat, even though you're trying to tell me not to. So one, the fat cell, the hypertrophic or swollen fat cell, becomes insulin resistant to prevent further growth, leaking free fatty acids into the blood in the midst of elevated insulin. And those two things should not be high at the same time. High insulin and high free fatty acids now means you're going to start storing fat in other places throughout the body, most especially the liver, getting fatty liver and excess fat in the pancreas, creating insulin resistance in those tissues. But the second problem, as I mentioned, is that the fat cell becomes hypoxic. It starts to suffocate, if you will, as it's gotten pushed too far from the capillary. The fat cell has a potential solution for that too, and that is by secreting a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines into the bloodstream. So the hypertrophic fat cell becomes very pro-inflammatory because some of those cytokines that it's secreting have the ability to promote the growth of new capillaries. And so it starts to correct its hypoxia by stimulating the growth of new fat cells, which is a better outcome than suffocating and becoming necrotic. Once again, a very messy, inflamed death if that were to happen. So the hypertrophic fat cell, in order to ensure its own survival, becomes insulin resistant to prevent further growth, inadvertently thereby flooding the body with free fatty acids to be stored elsewhere. And two, becomes very pro-inflammatory in order to correct its own hypoxia, but in the process, flooding the body with pro-inflammatory cytokines, things like C-reactive protein, for example, which is increasingly measured on blood tests. But the combination of these two things, high free fatty acids and high inflammation, is a wicked combination, because now you start promoting the accumulation of these other types of fats in the body called ceramides within the cells. And when these two signals come to a cell, promote ceramide development or accumulation, now those cells become insulin resistant as well. Whether it's the brain, whether it's the muscle, whether it's the liver, or the blood vessels, promoting hypertension. This is why I have a fat first focus, that fat cells are the first domino to fall. That when the fat cells become insulin resistant, that's that earliest stages where the insulin's going up, but it's all still enough to keep glucose in check. The muscles are still responding to the insulin, pulling in glucose. The liver is still responding to the insulin, pulling in and storing glucose, helping blood glucose levels stay low. But once the fat cells have become insulin resistant and now pro-inflammatory, they start spreading that insulin resistance to, like, for example, muscle and liver. Now you have the glucose levels start to climb. So where you have other people who may promote or advocate an idea that the muscle becomes insulin resistant first or the liver, I don't agree with that, because if that were the case, then glucose levels would start to climb immediately. They don't. Glucose levels stay low because insulin resistance starts in the very low metabolic rate fat cells, and then it spreads to the higher metabolic rate, higher glucose consuming tissues, like the muscle, for example. But anyway, Drew, to sort of put a fine little bow on this, to wrap it up nicely in response to your question, which was a long time ago, and it was this comment about your fasted insulin, how could you gain weight? To say that maybe in one final sense, the longer a body stays insulin sensitive, the more weight it can continue to gain. And this is why you see these instances of these TV shows where it's people who weigh 600 pounds. And yet, if you were to measure their blood and measure their metabolic markers, they would look probably pretty okay. Now, they're clearly not okay. There are consequences to having that degree of super massive obesity. But if we were to look at, say, their triglyceride to HDL ratio or their fasted insulin, it would probably be normal, because it's not the
You're saying that when
amount
they're
of fat.
at their heaviest, like we're talking about, like, let's say like the Biggest Loser or something, just to make sure, because I wasn't following. You're saying if we looked at their labs when they are at their heaviest or when they lost the weight?
No, even when they're heavy. Now, although it would depend on how close they'd come to their threshold. And maybe, let me say this another way, I guess. People who have the genetic propensity to continue to go through fat cell hyperplasia have an almost limitless amount of fat gain. I mean, maybe there would be a point at which the body simply would stop. But the fact that they can continue to gain more and more fat means that the fat tissue is responding to the insulin. And that means they keep multiplying their fat cells. What starts to happen in people who don't have hyperplasia, who have a set number of fat cells, which is actually how most people are across all ethnicities, despite kind of what I alluded to, Caucasian or not. Most people have a very finite number of fat cells. And this is why most people can't gain a limitless amount of weight. You know, Drew, you and I, if we were both to challenge ourselves to gain 500 pounds, it would probably be impossible. You know, maybe we could gain about 100 pounds. And then even if we kept eating and abusing our bodies that way, we simply would stop. We had reached our threshold of the total amount of fat our bodies could store. But now we start to really have the metabolic consequences of it, because the fat cells have reached their maximum point. Now all the metabolic mayhem ensues. We become hypertensive. We become very diabetic. But it's when the fat cells become insulin resistant that the body can't gain any more fat. That's why most people reach a limit. They've reached their threshold. And as the high insulin and the sufficient calories continue to try to tell the body to store more energy, now it can't be stored in the fat cells. And now you have what is sometimes referred to as ectopic fat deposition, where you're now storing fat in tissues that are poorly designed for the fat storage or for the long-term fat storage, like fatty liver disease, fatty pancreas, even too much fat in muscles, which facilitates insulin resistance in the muscle tissue. Anyway, that was a long answer, but hopefully there was some clarity in there.
No, there's a lot of great science that you shared there. So just a couple of questions off of that. Have you seen, and I don't know anybody personally, because I don't know anybody personally that's in my friend group that I interact with on a regular basis that's been on like a carnivore type diet. But have you seen some of these accounts online or at conferences? I know you speak at a lot of different conferences of people who are even on a carnivore diet talking about, it's not the vast majority, but even some of them talking about, hey, I've been doing carnivore for a little while, and I hit a point where I particularly noticed where I started gaining excess weight. Or some of these low carb conferences, sometimes people come. Obviously, it's always tough because you don't know exactly, are people, how much are they adhering to it? Do they have the data to back it up? But these, again, are anecdotal accounts where people would share similar things that, hey, I've been on what I consider to be, these seem to be a little bit more stricter individuals. I'm on a couple Facebook groups online where I kind of see some of these things. I wish I could brought some of those screenshots here, and maybe I'll follow up afterwards. But have you seen any of those accounts where people who are on carnivore strictly or on very strict low carb, and they themselves notice that that they could be in a situation where they could be gaining weight? Have you come across any of that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it definitely kind of challenges the dogmatic view that I don't want to necessarily convey. I hope that people can appreciate that I'm saying weight gain or weight loss is both a function of hormones and calories. But I've definitely seen that. I would say those are the anomaly, where it does appear that most people who say go carnivore, which is the, kind of purest end of the spectrum version, it's very uncommon for someone to notice any kind of weight gain unless they started a carnivore diet and they were underweight due to, some starvation, or they're just coming off, a poorly formulated vegan diet. It's not uncommon in that case to gain weight simply because the body is filling back out. But yeah, it is not hard for me to imagine what might be happening there. And I don't want to make it sound too simple for my own sake, but in those instances, I would say this is a person who probably either had type 2 diabetes when they started and thus very high insulin levels, or were very insulin resistant and had high insulin. And then the high insulin simply is still generally promoting fat storage. And in this case, promoting it from the fat calories that they're eating. They're not going to have any fat being produced from glucose really in this case, because they're not eating any. But if you have high insulin and you eat fat, you will store fat, or you will slow fat burning, or maybe you'll plateau before you want to and not get to the weight loss goal that you're hoping for.
And
so
high,
I would either say,
just to clarify, going back to your markers that you shared earlier, high for you, and again, you said that it's debated in different labs, would be, let's say, like 7 to 15, and definitely, of course, 15 and above. Is that what you're saying is higher?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. So we could maybe cut it off. I would almost want to refer to, work by George Cahill, who is really the godfather of fasting science. He noted that around 10 microunits per mil appeared to be the threshold where a body would shift over. Below that, it would go from fat breakdown, lipolysis. Above that, it would shift to inhibiting lipolysis. So relatively promoting perhaps a greater growth. Now, that wasn't a hard, fast number, but he proposed it on one of his figures, and he was such a legend in that regard that I can't help but feel comfortable invoking him there. So let's maybe in this case, in this conversation, we go around 10 microunits per mil. But if someone's fasting insulin were higher than that, getting into the teens, I would say that's a person who might want to incorporate fasting a little more regularly. So as much as I acknowledge that calories matter, I don't think it is prudent to focus on calories as the metric. I think calorie counting is doomed to fail because we simply cannot account for every calorie coming in, and you cannot account for every calorie going out. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself, Drew, but my view on, maybe I'll answer the question this way, and that might answer that question more explicitly. My view on weight loss is that you have 2 steps you can take to lose weight. One is a step to deliberately lower insulin, and the other is a step to deliberately lower energy coming in, or to lower calories. Too often, we take the first step with the low calorie step. And people just start cutting fat because that's the most calorie dense food, and they keep their carbohydrates as the main part of their diet. If a person is starting this weight loss journey and they're already insulin resistant or diabetic and they have high insulin, if the first step is low calorie, David Ludwig and other labs have shown this too, that if you just lower calories but insulin is staying high, the total amount of energy available, or the calorie-rich molecules in the blood, drops. So total energy availability goes down, and that stimulates greater hunger. So if you try to lose weight where you're cutting calories but you're not addressing the high insulin, insulin wants to tell the body to store energy. So it's always pushing energy from the blood into cells. Well, the brain is uniquely suffering in that case because the brain doesn't have a lot of energy storage capacity. Unlike the liver, which can store a few thousand calories as energy or glucose. Unlike the fat cells, which can store hundreds of thousands of calories. Or even muscle, which can store some thousands of calories in total. They have a little bit of reserve so that if the energy in the blood goes down, they can rely on their own energy for a time. Because they have it in them. The brain doesn't really have that capacity. It has a very, very modest amount of glycogen, but it needs to so combined with the fact that the brain has essentially no energy storage in itself, and the fact that the brain has a very, very high metabolic rate, it makes the brain very, very sensitive to analyzing. It's kind of the energy thermostat, the calorostat in the body, where if energy starts to go down, the brain panics. It senses that and will say, hey, I'm gonna start running out of energy. I have 2 pathways ahead of me. I either shut down because the energy isn't sufficient to maintain my current level of activity. In other words, lose consciousness, or I'm going to make us eat more, which is to say it increases hunger. And so if someone starts their weight loss journey without addressing the insulin, keeping insulin high, but cutting calories, then my worry is that is doomed to failure because hunger will win. I mean, to say this another way, if, Drew, you and I were hosting this beautiful buffet, and we've invited the world's best chefs to come prepare the most delicious foods. It is an all you can eat. We want to invite our friends and family to come enjoy this with us. We would tell them, friends and family, we're hosting this buffet. It is going to be the most delicious food you've ever had. Come hungry because you're going to want to try everything. What would be the two things our friends and family would do to come as hungry as possible? They would eat a little less in the days before the event, and they would probably exercise a little harder. Those are the two very pieces of advice that modern weight loss science is built on. Eat less, exercise more. And yes, it will put you into a caloric deficit. It will shrink your fat cells, but it will be a temporary win, because the more you're cutting energy in the midst of keeping insulin elevated without addressing insulin, you will go hungry. And sure enough, in this case, it worked. They come to the buffet as hungry as possible. But the problem is, if our weight loss strategy is built on those same ideas, hunger always wins. So before the first step of cutting calories is ever taken, let the first step be cutting insulin. So this is the idea of, my kind of three pillars of control carbohydrates, focus on the least starchy, sugary carbohydrates in your diet. So eat more fruits and vegetables, whole fruits and vegetables. Prioritize protein and don't fear fat, because fat is not going to have any effect on your insulin. And if you can follow those rules, insulin will come down and metabolic rate will go up, because when insulin comes down, metabolic rate goes up and fat burning will go up. And so now you have all of these other energy-rich sources in the blood. Now you have free fatty acids, which can be burned because insulin is low. And you have ketones, which will fuel the brain, because the moment ketones start coming into the blood, the brain will immediately start using them. And so we always say that glucose is the brain's preferred fuel. I reject that idea completely, because if you match glucose and ketones in the blood at the same level, the brain is relying more on the ketones than it is the glucose. So if it has a preference for either of those, it's the ketones. But suffice to say, if insulin is down, the blood is flush with energy, the brain has an abundance of energy, and it doesn't sense the panic if calorie coming in isn't what we expected it to be, because now the body is relying on its own energy for fuel, because in the midst of low insulin, we can mobilize all of that energy. It's not locked up. And so with the first step being lower your insulin, and if you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat, and you'll find that you're not as hungry because you're using your own energy for fuel. And that will typically, just that one step alone will get the person to a weight loss, to a significant weight loss, whether they get to where they want to get or not. Maybe they reach a plateau a little sooner. That will vary based on the person. But if they do get to a plateau and they find that they want to lose more, now we look at that other step and we say, okay, now it's time to start controlling the energy that's coming in. But rather than counting calories, which is a kind of miserable way to live, now it's just time for structured fasting. The fasting, combined with this lower insulin step already, will allow you to start naturally controlling the energy coming in, because you're structuring your meal plans in such a way to just limit the total amount that's coming in. But again, it's not taken, that step isn't taken with the explicit goal of reducing calories by some certain amount. It's still this idea of let the calories work themselves out. Now it's just time to start fasting. So that was my fourth rule. I already mentioned the three based on macronutrients: control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, and frequently fast. That fourth step is taken once the three other steps or three pillars have already been in place, allowing the body to lower its insulin, and with lower insulin start using its own energy for fuel, which you cannot do if insulin's elevated. And now it's not as much a panic or hunger if you skip some meals sometimes. The brain is adequately nourished because it's relying on the fat burning and the ketones that come from that you're able to use in the midst of low insulin.
What the heck is going on, especially right around the age of 40, that causes women in particular, not that men don't go through this too, but women in particular, to have so much of a tougher time shifting body composition and losing weight? You made an incredible video on this topic, and it was called the 5 of the top hormone patterns associated with weight gain in women. take us through these 5.
Absolutely. And this is something I hear from women every day, and I get it. And I know how frustrated they are. But look, there's something really happening. Your chemistry is shifting and your hormones are shifting. And those hormone shifts are something that we all really need to understand. The first one is probably the common thread, the common denominator. It's called insulin resistance. It's when our blood sugar levels start to get higher. There are a whole bunch of different reasons for that, which we can dive into. But those higher levels of blood sugar raise insulin. And so we end up storing more body fat, arm fat, back fat, all these things that really get us frustrated. Another pattern connected to that is estrogen dominance. That's where we start to store estrogen. We're holding on to it. We're not able to metabolize it effectively. So that's a super common pattern that really rears its head right at 40. In addition to that, kind of connected to that is low progesterone. So low progesterone often is starting as early as your 20s, but really exaggerates as you hit 40 or so. And as progesterone drops, those patterns of insulin resistance and estrogen dominance get worse. And then we've got the thyroid. So the thyroid is something that I feel like is underdiagnosed, not checked enough. So many women are walking around in a hypothyroid state where it's just not working very well. And that's a huge player of a body composition change, but really, again, starts to show itself more so as we all turn 40. And then last, and we could probably spend an hour on this one, certainly not least, is cortisol. The effects of cortisol on body composition are real and really change what insulin's doing, what blood sugar is doing, what all the other hormones are doing, and can really, no matter what we're doing with diet or exercise, sabotage our best efforts.
So these are all hormonal patterns. But what are these hormonal patterns allowing to make the situation more challenging in the body? And are there lifestyle factors that are making these hormonal patterns express themselves in a worse off way, right? Is diet, lifestyle play into any of this?
Well, diet and lifestyle is absolutely a factor at any point, right? But what everyone gets frustrated with is I'm eating clean, I'm working out. Usually when I gained weight, I would go back on my workout regimen or my diet regimen and everything would come right off. And now it no longer is doing that. That's where it's really important to understand the chemistry associated with these hormone shifts. One of the fundamental things that are happening as these hormones are going in different directions is the first thing that gets affected is your gut health. So you're seeing a shift because of changing estrogen levels, because of changing progesterone levels, because of cortisol. You're seeing a shift in the microbiome, which is all the bacteria that live in our gut. And as that microbiome is changing, a lot of other gut factors are changing. And as they change, we see blood sugar going up, we see insulin going up, and then we're dealing with weight and body composition issues all over again. Same thing with thyroid hormones. I always say cortisol and thyroid are kind of like on a seesaw. If you're stressed and you're busting it, you're going to drain the thyroid, right? So people, when they start to see that they're gaining weight, they're like, oh my God, I have to exercise harder. I'm going to do more. I'm going to, be more aggressive about this. Well, they're worsening cortisol and they're crashing their thyroid. So some women are coming in with this sort of cortisol adrenal imbalance, and that's really the chemistry that's blocking them from losing weight. So we've got a lot of chemistry involved, whether it is hormones impacting gut health, hormones impacting how the liver works and how we clear toxins, hormones impacting our sleep. And so the inability to really bring cortisol down because we're not getting healthy sleep. But at the end of the day, the hormones are the levers, sort of, so to speak, that are driving this engine while everyone's sort of like scrambling, trying to figure out how to fix it, but not understanding that there's root chemistry involved with all of it.
You had a great video that was a follow-up to this original video.
Yeah.
And you were walking through a few of the key things. I think there was 4 things you had in the video that were solutions and foods that play a role with each of these areas.
Yeah.
And those things, just top level, were, balancing insulin resistance with protein, how to handle estrogen dominance with fiber. You slid in a little bit of one of your favorite foods, Greek yogurt. We'll talk about why that's the case. And you also talked about the importance of protecting your liver from toxic overload, from a lot of the things that are hidden in our environment that are attacking it and our bodies, and the impact of that on hormones, both for men and women, of course.
Yes.
So let's talk about these solutions and how they play into these 5 hormonal patterns, starting with the first one. Why is making sure that, especially for women, getting adequate amounts of protein in the day so important when it comes to insulin resistance?
So one of the things a hormone shift will do is really mess with blood sugar. So as estrogen drops, as progesterone drops, if you're storing any of these hormones, you're seeing a lot of shifts in blood sugar. So your average blood sugar is up. It's not abnormal to the point of being diabetic, but it's definitely up from where you were probably 5 years, 8 years, 10 years ago. The reason protein is so important here is it actually helps to push that blood sugar level down. That's one thing it does. It helps to stabilize the insulin levels. But the other thing that protein will do is it really helps with satiety. It acts like a GLP-1 type medication almost in a way where you're feeling full, you're feeling satiated. So you're not grabbing constantly for something to manage those energy dips or those hunger pangs or cravings or any of these things that happen. What we're finding is that protein loading in particular in the morning, getting close to 30, sometimes even up to 40 grams of protein first thing in the morning will dictate your metabolic health for the rest of the day. That's pretty powerful. And in addition to that, if we think about sort of this perimenopause period with hormone levels declining, right, including testosterone, then we know that protein is a way to build muscle. It helps us to hold on to muscle. It gives us the raw material for muscle building, regardless of what type of workout you're doing. So protein plays a number of different roles, stabilizing blood sugar, preventing cravings, helping us to stay nice and full, and then also assisting us with the muscle building that we really need going into the next few decades that continues to keep our metabolism humming.
So the next one you went into was estrogen dominance and how fiber in our diet actually can help remove and get rid of a lot of the androgens that end up damaging the body when there's excess amount of them in there. Can you make that connection?
Definitely. So let's talk through this pathway. So we've got estrogen, we've got testosterone. When they get converted into different metabolites. The metabolites of testosterone are the androgens. Sometimes excess testosterone gets converted into estrogen. So you've got the cyclical pathway happening over and over again. High levels of estrogen metabolites actually trigger insulin resistance. We see this pattern together over and over again. Women know they're having that issue because they've got issues like breast tenderness, heavy breasts. They might have gone up a cup size, or they may be holding onto a lot more fat kind of in their hips and thighs. That estrogen dominance has to be sort of assisted by providing a lot more fiber, because here's what's happening. As the hormone levels are changing, we are losing a really important gut bacteria that comes from fiber. It's called ruminococcus. And as our hormone levels are all over the place, we need more ruminococcus, but what's happening is we actually have less. So the solution needs to be have more fiber. We need 40, 50 grams of fiber per day. And we need a mix of soluble and insoluble fiber, which many women are not getting. The answer I usually get in practice is, well, I'm getting salads or I eat vegetables, but sometimes that's still not giving you enough soluble fiber that you might get from like psyllium husk or chia seeds or some of these other seeds and things like that. So fiber helps the microbiome pick up those estrogen metabolites, recycle them, and move them through the body. If it's not present, if that bacteria is not present due to the lack of fiber, then we hold on to those estrogen metabolites and in turn deal with all the different symptoms that follow. So that's why fiber is critical for any of us dealing with estrogen dominance and really plays a huge role in managing that hormone pattern, but indirectly managing the insulin resistance that we just talked about.
We'll go deeper into fiber a little bit later on, but just a couple of your favorites. You mentioned psyllium husk, chia. Are there other things that are there that you also want people to be thinking about incorporating into their diet during this time?
Definitely. I mean, I'm going to stick to patterns. So if we talk to estrogen dominance in particular, one of the big things we talk a lot about when it comes to food are getting in enough omega-9 fats that actually helps to metabolize estrogen as well. So these are going to be found in avocados, olive oil, adding that into your daily diet. And we also want the cruciferous vegetables, right? They have something called meta-I3C in them and indole-3 carbinol that actually helps us take estrogen from like estradiol, break it all the way down, helps the body eliminate it and recycle it effectively. We've got great research that's showing how all of this works and works together. But for patients with estrogen dominance or anybody out there listening or watching who thinks that's their issue, those are your top three. Getting in enough fiber, soluble and insoluble, getting in at least 5 to 7 servings of cruciferous vegetables every week, and getting in about a tablespoon of olive oil daily or about a quarter of an avocado to get those omega-9 fats in their system.
It's interesting. You mentioned that really targeting that 40 to 60 grams of fiber.
Yeah.
If you would give a range of often the new patient that's coming into your clinic.
Oh, wow.
You have a clinic in Atlanta.
Yep.
Now, maybe in New York, it's coming up.
We have one coming up in New York, and we have a couple locations in Atlanta. But yeah, and then we see patients virtually too. But the average,
the average people are coming in. I mean, I think I looked online and like whoever was putting out the stats, FDA, CDC, whoever it is, was like the average American gets like 15 grams or less of fiber. I see a lot of people that are getting like 5 to 10 grams of fiber. The patient that's coming into your clinic, probably a little bit more aware, but still I would imagine just looking around, their fiber intake is probably more around like 20 to 30 grams.
Right. I would say 20 is about where most of our patients, and these are patients that have, really tried hard to learn as much as they can. They're still pushing the cusp of that 20 grams of fiber per day. So I think we're just, again, not aware of how little fiber we're getting in. I think a lot of those patients too are not getting in enough protein. Most of them are under-proteined, if that's a word, but they're getting in about 40 to maybe 50 grams of protein a day, which is simply not enough in sort of the environment of declining hormones.
Let's just touch on for a second, toxic load.
Yeah.
And the impact of the things that are going on in our homes.
Right.
In the products we use.
Right.
What is in those products and what are those things doing to our body? And kind of a third part to it, how is that impacting the hormonal patterns?
Definitely. So, you've seen a lot wherever you turn about toxicity, toxic load, detoxing. Again, I feel like all this gets thrown around a lot. But here's what's actually happening. When we are getting exposed to a range of different chemicals, these include BPA, BHT, organophosphates, there's so many different groups, dyes, additives, MSG. I mean, I could probably go on. The body has a certain tolerance, right? It's sort of just like your bandwidth. The body has a certain tolerance for taking all those chemicals, breaking them down and moving them through. At some point, you top off. It's like, I can't do this anymore. That's your liver. This is too much. The load is too heavy. And then when you factor in other things like the genetics of an individual, the stress levels of a particular individual, their environment, then you know that everyone has variable levels of toxic sort of ability or capacity. And so what's happening is as those levels are hit, the liver essentially can no longer filter those through. Those become estrogen mimickers. So whether you are male or a child or female, it doesn't matter. That same pattern is taking place. These toxins are becoming estrogen mimickers. So they're creating conditions of estrogen dominance across the board. And that in turn is leading to lots of other conditions. First, the hormone disruption, because anytime one hormone goes off, they don't live in isolation, right? They're all communicating. Then you have fallout with all the other hormones too. So as someone becomes more and more estrogen dominant from toxicity, then in turn, you're going to see high androgens. That's the reason high androgens are things like DHT, DHEAS, testosterone, free testosterone. That is the reason that I believe that a condition like PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, is almost an epidemic, right? I mean, more and more younger and younger women are coming in with the symptoms and the diagnostic sort of criteria that meets PCOS. And this is, I think, an issue of increasing toxicity in our environment. That's paired to another issue that this toxicity and this estrogen dominance creates, which is precocious puberty. We're seeing girls go into puberty earlier and earlier, right? The average age used to be 12, 13, then it dropped to 11. Now it's down to 7 or 8, So we're seeing that shift downward, which is not what we want for our girls. We're seeing it in our boys as they hold on to estrogen. What's the fallout for them as they hit their 20s with testosterone? So we're seeing declining levels of testosterone in men. So this idea of toxicity and your toxic load is something I'm super passionate about people understanding, because what essentially we're doing is shifting everyone towards a pattern of estrogen dominance, which in turn is impacting the rest of the hormone profile.
We're going to go through all those key times that women experience these shifts.
Definitely.
There's 5 in the book.
Yes.
By the way, your book is fantastic. It's The Hormone Shift. We have the link in the show notes. Everybody can pick it up. Buy it for a woman in your life that you love.
Please.
Spread it out. Just a couple more questions here on the topic of weight loss, so we can put a little bow tie on that.
Sure. Yeah.
And then we can set up a little bit more about the book and some of the key insights on there. So the question that I have is that these hormonal patterns, you mentioned a few of them: insulin resistance, thyroid, androgens, estrogen dominance, cortisol, and stress. The question that I have is that Do these, when the hormonal patterns are off, in particular, we're talking about women right around that age of 40, right? My sort of core demographic of this audience here. When these are off, either individually or together, do they create a situation where they could lead to, of course, poor metabolic health, right? Insulin resistance is part of that. But in turn, those things cause or are encouraging overeating or overconsumption in calories, right? Which fundamentally, then that would be part of the reason that somebody would be gaining weight. Or is there something unique about these 5 being off that when they're brought into balance, even if somebody was consuming, even though health is so much more than calories in and out, is there something unique with these 5 that the same amount of calories are taken and just simply bringing them into balance, so to speak, would lead somebody to losing weight? Does that make sense?
It does. A little bit of yes to both. All right. So let's break it down a little bit. So first of all, what do these hormone shifts just do to general metabolic health? Well, we know they slow down overall metabolism. They slow it down because the gut slows down, the liver gets sluggish, the microbiome shifts, blood sugar goes up, insulin goes up, we start to store weight, body composition changes. That's the most simplistic way of describing that. So what these hormone shifts do, though, to contribute to that pattern is that, for example, if someone's got very low progesterone levels, typically they are having a lot more issues with blood sugar stability. So they're going to have cravings, right? I've been there, like salt cravings. They want chips, they want popcorn, they want something to satisfy that craving. Or as for a lot of women, because their cycles are now all over the place, they're actually craving magnesium. But what they think is, I want dark chocolate, right? How many women do you know that crave dark chocolate right around that time? So they're indulging in, they're trying to self-medicate without knowing that they're self-medicating. So salt is managing a low progesterone. You know, something like dark chocolate is also managing a low progesterone. We know that if someone's got a lot of blood sugar instability, they're going to crave carbohydrates because they're getting that quick fix, right? They're like, I feel bad. My blood sugar's off. Something's wrong. I can't focus. So they're going to grab for something that very quickly satisfies them. They're fine for an hour, maybe 2, and then they crash again. So they consume again. So you've got this cyclical pattern of overconsumption driven by this reactive hypoglycemia or insulin resistance that presents in women kind of in their late 30s, early 40s. So all of these hormone shifts themselves trigger changes in what we want to eat, how full we feel, and the choices that we make. Same with thyroid. When thyroid's off, you're tired a lot. You know, you're kind of crashing, you're falling asleep on the couch. So what do? You over caffeinate to try to keep yourself up and moving. Too much caffeine spikes insulin, right? That spikes insulin. And again, you're driving this pathway all over again. So first part of the question is absolute yes. You know, the hormone shifts themselves change our behavior, which influence our metabolic health. They impact sleep, right? That's a big part of metabolism as well. So when thyroid's off, when cortisol's off, when progesterone's off, when estrogen's too low, we're not able to sleep, whether that's falling asleep or staying asleep. So you've got that whole, you know, kind of ball of wax to undo there. And then at the same time, let's say you are perfectly balanced and you're consuming, the gut is actually working better. The liver is actually working better. So between that gut-liver dynamic, which goes all the way back to Eastern medicine, right, you are now able to metabolize your food much better. So you are absorbing fat. You have a more stable microbiome. You're moving food through the colon and through the body and the small bowel more effectively. So all of these things allow for a more efficient metabolic process. In addition to that, you're able to retain the muscle that you're building or the muscle that you had. When there's patterns of hormone depletion or any of those patterns that we've talked about, you're actively losing muscle, which then again makes the metabolic component worse. So that's why, you know, when people are like, where do I start in this conversation? Like, where do I begin? I'm gaining weight. I don't feel good about myself. You know, what's happened here? They've got to start with foundational chemistry, which is getting their hormones checked and getting those hormones balanced, working on the gut and gut health, because I think that interface between the gut and the hormones lay the basis for healthy metabolism. Only then can you then move on and start to get really nitpicky about diet and exercise and all these other things. Now, having said that, you can't balance hormones, you know, from a laboratory standpoint and work on the gut and give somebody probiotics and all this other stuff that we do, but then they're consuming very
Ultra-processed
poor
foods,
quality
whatever.
diet, and they're completely sedentary and all that other stuff, right? But we're not talking about those extremes. We're talking about, the woman I meet every day in practice or even when I speak, who's just, I'm trying to lose weight. I'm doing what I know to do. Nothing's changing. Nothing's happening. What's going on? And then when we dial into the specifics, we can see either the behavior patterns that are sabotaging her because of a hormone shift, or the hormone shift itself that's driving the entire thing.
No, it's a great explanation. I think that the nuance is important because essentially what you're saying is that calories do matter,
Yep.
and they're not the entire conversation.
No.
And I think it's useful, and I think this is part of wellness movement growing
Right.
up,
Right.
right? It's the Western side of things, right?
Right.
Because we live in a highly addictive world with carbohydrate sources
Everywhere.
all around
Yep.
us, and they're highly addictive, and they tempt us to want to overeat. And I think it's easy to look at it if we're only looking from a holistic lens, or holistic is actually both, so I won't
Right.
say that.
Right.
We're only looking at it from a sense of, if hormones themselves are just independently fixed, then I can eat whatever I want, man or woman, and it doesn't make a difference. Well, fundamentally, if you're going to lose weight, you're going to end up eating less calories
Right.
typically. But the other side of the equation is that there's all these things, insulin resistance, thyroid, you mentioned you're not sleeping well. There's plenty of studies we'll link to in the show notes. You don't sleep well one night, you crave carbohydrates more the next day,
Absolutely.
you overconsume calories the next
Yes.
day. These things all play in together. And that's why you want to look at them through the lens that you look at them. One last item here. What is hormonal belly, and what is the root cause of it?
Oh, hormone belly. So literally, I've experienced this. Many others have too. You literally see your belly pop back out at certain times of the month and then go back in at other times of the month. And you feel like either you're pregnant, if you're in that stage of life, you're like, oh my God, what's going on? Why do I look pregnant? And it just it's like a fluctuating belly is probably the best way to describe it. It's not the belly that hangs and stays forever. It's literally like a balloon. It's there, it's gone, it's there, it's gone, it's there, it's gone. And it drives everybody insane. They think something's wrong with them.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Absolutely.
Is it only for women who are actively getting their period, or in a place of perimenopause where their period is still at least there in some capacity?
It's worse in perimenopause.
Okay.
I feel like young women have it to a certain extent, but I feel like it exaggerates and it worsens in perimenopause. It sort of continues into menopause to a point, but it very much is associated with digestive health and what the hormones are doing to the gut at that particular week or phase of the cycle. So low progesterone will create a hormone belly. High estrogen will create a hormone belly for sure. And that fluctuation between estrogen and progesterone is usually what's responsible for that. The one little caveat to that is that I do like anyone complaining of those type of issues or symptoms, I'd like them to get a pelvic ultrasound so we can look at the lining of the uterus and look and make sure there's nothing like ovarian cyst or fibroids or things like that. But that's what hormone belly is.
We mentioned in the book, there are 5 key shifts that are there that women go through. These sort of archetypes of life stages
Right.
that are there. The rock star shift, the hustler shift, the superstar shift,
Right.
the superwoman shift,
Yep.
and the commander
Yep.
shift that's there. Let's take that age range right around 40, and I think it might be overlapping a little
Right.
bit,
It
plus
does,
or minus.
yeah. Mhm.
Which one of these shifts is this woman kind of in this archetype phase are they in? And how would you describe this sort of phase of their life?
So most of these women are in what I call the superwoman phase. And there's a very important reason why I labeled it that. Many of these women, sort of late 30s, 40s, sort of mid to late 40s, many of them are walking into one of the most stressful periods, I think, of their lives because they have grown or built a family, right, of some kind. So they have some level of responsibility there. They have invested in a career typically, and that career has grown with responsibility. So oftentimes they're leaders or they have a team or these other things on their plate that they have to manage. At the same time, their relationships are at an interesting point for those who have been in a relationship, from their early 30s or even their late 20s. When they hit sort of this superwoman phase, those relationships are kind of undergoing some changes, which are all good if they are handled in the right way. But there's sort of like a cleansing period for the relationship. And then they're aging parents, right? So this is about the time where a lot of parents start to have issues. So women are often the epicenter of all of this stuff happening. Kids, family, career, parents, relationships. And so they're highly stressed and they're trying to pull all the pieces together. So for many women, this is really where they feel like they're becoming unglued, right? This is where they're snapping more. This is where they're crying more. This is where they're getting super irritable, or physically they're seeing the changes for the first time, right? They're seeing like, why am I gaining weight? Why is my hair falling? What's happening to my skin? I have joint pain. Sometimes they will ignore it. The most common thing for a superwoman to do in this, this demographic is that they'll ignore things, right? They'll power through, they'll muscle through. That's the mentality. I've got too much to do. I've got too much on my plate. I'm just going to get through this, and when I get to that point over there, it'll all be over and I can deal with X, Y, or Z then. Many times years go by, right? And they've got these symptoms, they've got these conditions, and there's a fallout. And that fallout could be how they feel, how they look. It could be a diagnosis of some kind. This is where a lot of autoimmune diseases get diagnosed. This is where, of course, a lot of breast cancer we pick up. Or it could be in the form of a relationship, catastrophe. They might get a divorce, whatever it is, but this is a very, very tricky, tenuous time for women. And I think it's so important for them to be able to pull back and understand what's happening. Sometimes you're just not aware. You think you're supposed to kind of go through the motions of life without a lot of thought or, kind of thinking through it. But what I'm hoping is women will be aware that all of this is happening within them internally, emotionally, there are changes too. And it's really important for them to be able to put those puzzle pieces together so that when they're conducting themselves through a day, whether that's leading a meeting, dealing with a partner, raising a child, whatever it is, dealing with a parent, they're doing it with a clear mind and with clear intention, not like they're just kind of running from task to task to task. And so I think this is an important one. This is almost harder, I think, than actual menopause, because I think the lead up, menopause, you kind of finally, from most women and from most of the patients that I work with, they're like, I got this. I arrived. I'm here. I know who I am. I know what I need to do to take care of myself. I no longer need to people please. I no longer think I need to get everything done. But this perimenopausal time, the superwoman time, we're still learning those lessons, and if we learn them and learn them well and learn them in a timely manner, life is amazing for the next 20, 30 years. But if we ignore them and we continue to try to power through them, then the body will teach us, or our environment around us will teach us the lessons we're supposed to be learning.
Well said. So it seems that there's these independent stressors that a lot of women in this archetype
go through.
Kids at a certain stage, career, the demands of a relationship, aging parents, all the items that you listed. And part of what you're talking about in the book is that because there's just been so little education around hormones for both men and women,
right?
But in the particular case of women not being supported through the medical system and not having practitioners who necessarily understand of the intersection of Eastern and Western medicine and holistic medicine, there are lifestyle factors that get exacerbated around this time. When you look at this patient that is coming in, and you said it was the Superwoman archetype that are coming in, what are the most damaging types of habits, behaviors that most people look out in the world and they think this is normal, this is what everybody's doing, that lead to this acceleration? Yes, the independent stressors are there, life, family, etc. But there are also these lifestyle aspects that are there. So what are the common things that you see that are contributing to this being a tough time hormonally for a lot of women?
Definitely. I mean, I think some of the hormonal changes are happening, but here's where the body's saying something's got to change. First of all, I think the over-exercising, right? Many women get to this phase and they're like, I need to exercise and work out harder because they're seeing a physical change. So they'll engage in HIIT or marathons or, something that's very physically taxing to the body. Those are fine in small spurts, but for a stressed woman, you're actually making the cortisol sort of thyroid issue worse. So one of sort of the lifestyle things that I see change there is sort of this like workout culture where extremes are the only only avenue to success, right? So we need to come somewhere in the middle with that and have a little bit more fluidity around that, where we're balancing what we do with movement. I think another one is our alcohol culture, right? So I think drinking wine nightly has been touted as a relaxation technique, as a stress management technique, where in actuality, as you hit sort of this particular phase, with the gut already slowing down, we don't really have any alcohol tolerance. We can't metabolize it. We can't move it through the body because everything is slowing down a little bit. So I think that leads to hormone belly. It leads to estrogen dominance. It leads to all kinds of other things we can talk about. So that's a habit that I see over and over again for sure. I think another one is simply not sleeping, and that not sleeping can look different for different people. But one of the things I see is sort of like you're on your phone at night, or you wake up in the middle of the night and you check your phone again. And what's happening there is that you're constantly stimulating the body. You're messing with sort of the pineal gland that receives light, and you're not really allowing the body to go in a resting state. And one of the fundamental things I learned in my 20s with Chinese medicine is if we don't sleep as women, if we are not sleeping between about 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., we're going to disrupt the HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary axis. We're going to disrupt that because it needs that critical time to rest, to reboot, and to recharge. So we've got a lot of women, right, working till super late in the night, sending emails, or rechecking things on a phone in the middle of the night when they wake back up, and staying in sort of this exaggerated high cortisol state, hitting the day, skipping breakfast, right? Not eating, fasting for extended periods of time, which are not great for the stressed woman, and then not thinking through their food or planning their food. So they're kind of grabbing and going, or waiting until they hit the evening to eat. And at that point, they're either so ravenous that they're eating everything, or they have now trained the brain to not eat. So they're under eating and not getting the protein and the macronutrients and things like that they need. So short term, sure, they might lose some weight, whatever's happening there. Long term, they shut down metabolism and they start to gain weight.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
We're constantly telling the body to store energy, and it becomes hard to use the energy to break things down. And we have to break things down for human health, not only just to shrink a fat cell, but even like